I won't take much time because we've got a full load for you. If you had a chance to get a little half-page program, great. If not, Charles has got some of those available and is glad to pass them out. It gives you the names and the titles of our lectures. Each lecture is scheduled for 25 minutes. I'm going to give you the introduction to the first three scholars, each one 25-minute lecture. When they're done, there'll be a 15-minute break. Our first speaker is Lawson Younger. Lawson is I asserted at a scholar's lunch today, and I will reassert today, and you can challenge me if you want. I think he reads cuneiform better than anyone else who's in the building right now. But if you want a cuneiform off a contest with him, you can do so. He teaches at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He teaches a number of Old Testament courses, Hebrew courses, but also languages from the ancient Near East. And we've got a number of his books in the library. He is one of the most accomplished scholars in areas of Assyriology and other such things. He will be speaking on Israelites and Judahites in Assyria and Babylon in cuneiform sources. And please understand, he knows this stuff because he's translated them. He's written on them. You're truly hearing a world-class scholar on this material. Next we have James Hoffmeier, who Jim is an Egyptologist at Trinity as well. There he is. He's got a new book out on some pharaoh from some time gone by who flirted with monotheism for a while, and it justifies a book before he got thrown out for being a monotheist. But anyway, so Jim is here and has been a presenter, and so Jim will go next on Judeans in Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem in 586. And then our third speaker is Richard Hawes. Richard is a friend of ours from England whose PhD is in the subject he will be speaking to us about. Did Edom annex parts of southern Judah following the fall of Jerusalem in 567-68 BC? And so these are our speakers. As you're picking up, we are dealing with the idea of what happened to Israel, or to Judah, let's be more correct, after the fall from the Babylonian times, which happened in 586 BC. And so what happened? Those are the issues that we'll be discussing today with these scholars. Each presentation, 25 minutes. If the scholar leaves time, there'll be 2 or 3 minutes of question and answer while we're filling in some other stuff and getting ready for the next speaker. And with that, I give you Lawson Younger.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be with you. It's a great privilege to be with you, so thank you for coming. I am speaking about Israelites and Judahites in Assyria and Babylonia according to the cuneiform sources. There are two parts to what I'm going to be talking about, and that is Israelites and Judahites, first of all, in Neo-Assyrian sources. And so the first, I need to talk a little bit about the Israelite deportations. So there were multiple deportations from the northern kingdom of Israel by 3 different Assyrian kings, and you can see them listed here: Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, and Sargon II. These kings were responsible for the Assyrian expansion in the last half of the 8th century, and perhaps, do we have a pointer? I'm going to need a pointer if you've got one. Donka. Okay, so this is Assyria at the time that Tiglath-Pileser came to the throne. This is the Assyrian Empire when Sargon II finished his reign. So you can see quite an expansion. First of all, the deportation in the days of Tiglath-Pileser III. There were multiple prongs of the attack of Tiglath-Pileser III into Israel, mostly in Galilee and in the Gilead area, coastal plain as well. And so you can see here on the map different angles at which they came in. Two particular places of interest, Gezer and Ashtaroth. These are recorded in Assyrian reliefs. Here you can see Gezer, and we know it's Gezer because it says so. And that's how we know, of course, the identification here. This is Ashtaroth, and you can see Israelites here being taken into captivity. A actual photo of the British Museum relief can be seen here, and these are Israelites being taken into captivity. The evidence from Lower Galilee seems to indicate that this was a unidirectional deportation. In other words, they only deported from one area and did not deport others back into that area. And so this was not the typical Assyrian practice. Normally it was bidirectional. And so some of these areas of the northern kingdom were basically depopulated. A number of surveys of Lower Galilee have shown that the population was about 17,600. There were, in fact, 13,500 deported from this area according to Assyrian inscriptions. So that means that the area was largely depopulated. With this particular series of deportations, Israel was left as simply being a rump state just around the area of Samaria. These had been created into either provinces or at a later point incorporated into other provinces of the Assyrian Empire. Shalmaneser V was the next Assyrian king to come on the throne, and at this point there was a capture and destruction of Samaria in 722. This was after a 3-year siege. It is not only found in 2 Kings 17, but also in the Babylonian Chronicle, and so we know all about Shalmaneser V's activities. However, Shalmaneser V died a natural death only a few months after the conquest of Samaria, and so as a result could not have deported too many of the Israelites, even as a result of his besieging and conquest of Samaria. And so there would have been a little bit, but not a big deportation. This is, in fact, a slide showing you the hill of Samaria, which is quite an impressive sight. And so you can understand why it took the Assyrians a little bit of time to get up and conquer this city. Sargon II came onto the throne in 722. In other words, he assumed rule sometime after the death of Shalmaneser V. We are not clear on exactly all the details of this for the very simple reason that he is not the king that should have assumed the power at this point. There was, in fact, a civil war for a while. But in 720 BC, in other words, just 2 years after the fall of Samaria, Sargon II needed to reconquer Samaria. And this was connected to Sargon II's massive campaign to reconquer all of the Levant. And he records in his inscriptions, as you can see here, that the inhabitants of Samarina, this is Samaria, who agreed and plotted with a king hostile to me not to do service and not to bring tribute to Asher, and who did battle. I fought against them with the power of the great gods, my lords, and I counted as spoil 27,280. In another text, we know it's actually 10 more people, together with their chariots and their gods in which they trusted. I formed a unit with 200 of their chariots for my royal force, and I settled the rest of them in the midst of Assyria. I repopulated Samarina, that is Samaria, more than before, and I brought into it people from countries conquered by my hands. I appointed my eunuch as governor over them, and I counted them as Assyrians. And this was then a bidirectional deportation that was the beginning of the process process of the creation of the people that we later on know as the Samaritans. This was a rapid reconquest of the city in 720 BC and a bi-directional deportation as the result was implemented. And 2 Kings 17:6 records the three places that the Assyrians deported the Israelites. And here you can see in red, Halak, and then goes on, and then the towns of the Medes. Most people reading the Bible look at these and just keep reading. In other words, they don't look at a map, don't pay any attention to the significance of what is there. But we can trace these on a map, and in fact, goes on is in, no question, is the place called Guzana, and it is here on the Habor River, which of course is in fact mentioned in the text here, okay? And so this is one of the places that they are deported. They are also deported to Halak, that is Halaku, that is the province that is just to the north and east of Nineveh, modern-day Mosul, and then to the cities of the Medes, as you can see here. And so I'm just rehearsing here what I was just saying, that Halak is in fact the province, and goes on is in fact Guzana, and the cities of the Medes is located around the site of Harhar. And so once again, you can see what I am trying to point out here. So the bulk of this lecture is really going to look at what we know about the Israelites in exile. So what I was doing there is just laying the groundwork to help you understand how they got there, okay? So now we want to talk about identification of Hebrew persons in Neo-Assyrian sources. How do we identify them? Well, there are four ways. One is Assyrian reliefs, and these may give hints as to ethnicity through particular clothing. And I will show that particularly with regard to Judahites. We have some indication there. In the case of another is by the ethnicon Sumerian. In other words, this can be a place beside the personal name of an individual, Joe the Sumerian, okay? And so in any case, that would be another way. A third way is personal names, where that these may derive from a root that is only attested in Hebrew. In other words, it's not attested in other West Semitic sources, so that we don't have confusion here. And then finally, the predominant way is the method by identifying Israelites or Judahites in the textual materials, and this is through the use of a form of the divine name, Yahweh, in the personal names. So to give you an illustration of how this works, you can see here a contract, a legal binding contract, and here are a list of witnesses, okay? And here is just identifying, here's a witness, okay? And then this sign here lets us know here comes a personal name, and then this is the personal name. And the last cuneiform signs there give us the theophoric. So to illustrate how this works then is we would look at either if the personal name is fronted, in other words, has the theophoric element fronted, that is a God name fronted, then it will be spelled out this way in cuneiform syllabic script. If it's at the end, it'll be spelled out this way. This is the only way, the only ways that it can be spelled in Neo-Assyrian. And so going back to my text here is again the personal name. So if we look at it here, it breaks down in the following way. We have two signs meaning ba and na, and then ia and a, and, or a, and then u. And this gives us ba na ya u. That is, those that know Hebrew will see, of course, this is the personal name, ba na yahu. And Yahweh built or created would be the meaning of the name. So this is how we are able to actually trace Israelites in the cuneiform sources without any doubt. these must be Israelites, certainly before 701 BC. But in 701 BC, okay, so for 20-some years or 30 years, we have Israelites being deported to Assyria, and we can identify them through these personal names. But in 701 BC, Sennacherib invaded Judah. This is the very famous invasion recorded in the book of Kings and also in Isaiah, in which Sennacherib attempts to conquer Judah. And we know from his own inscriptions that he claims to have deported 200,000 Judahites. Now, whether that figure is accurate or not, scholars debate that. Scholars like to debate everything, but particularly number of figures, okay? That's something that we really like to go at one another about. But even if that number is not precisely accurate, okay, it is supported undoubtedly, at least in one sense, by excavations, because excavations in Judah during this period show beyond any doubt that Judah was devastated, and there certainly were deportations of Judahites to Assyria. Well, the Judahites, their names would have been written the exact same way. So at 701 on, we cannot be definitively sure that we're looking at Israelites as opposed to Judahites, but there's no way for us to distinguish between them in the cuneiform record. We simply have Hebrew names. They might be Israelites, they might be Judahites. My own assumption is that most of these are Israelites, but that is just my working hypothesis. So Israelites actually found in the Neo-Assyrian sources. What we find, and that's a free advertisement for something that you really don't need. It's not a good software. I wish I didn't buy it. Anyway, here we have Israelites and Neo-Assyrian sources. There are two different types. We understand that they filtered their deportees before they took them to Assyria. What they were trying to do is match what they needed with the skill set of the people there. So there were those that received preferred treatment or at least a reasonable treatment. This was a relatively small number. And then those who received hardship and bare subsistence. This was a large number of the deportees. The filtering process took place by the individual deportees' prior status and skills and how these matched up with the Assyrian administrative needs. The Assyrian reliefs give evidence of this filtering process, which I will show you in a second. Certainly, the emotional impact on uprooted individuals was massive, and this is beyond the scope of the time that I have in the lecture to talk about, but we certainly can trace some of that. And then, generally, nuclear families were kept intact, but extended familial ties were severed. The Assyrians did not allow extended families to stay together. They did not allow clans or tribes to stay together, so it is an extreme misnomer to talk about the lost tribes of Israel. They were not tribal. Furthermore, they weren't lost. They knew where they were, and the Assyrians knew where they were, and we now know where they were. So they weren't lost, okay? So there weren't any lost tribes, in there. And then all subsequent theories, and I won't go into those, are, yeah. All right. So Assyrian deportations were not death marches. The Assyrians were extremely concerned with their deportees getting there in good health, okay? So just to illustrate that particular point, I've quoted a letter here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what you can see here is very simply that the king is requiring these two fellows to be responsible for getting the deportees there. And in fact, I'm quoting here, 7 times over, you shall not be careless, for that you would die. These officials are held accountable with death if they don't deliver these deportees in good health. If anyone is sick, get them healthy, send them on. I'm summarizing for time purposes here. Here we can see a slide that illustrates the process of filtering. And so these guys are actually being interrogated. They're probably being interrogated for a number of different reasons, particularly since they are obviously bonded here. But you will also notice that they're being interrogated by 2 different scribes. One is writing in cuneiform script on a clay tablet, the other one in Aramaic on a papyrus. And this, of course, is quite interesting. There was a dual process of documentation in ancient Assyria. The Assyrian tortures and the emotional distress that would be inflicted on these people Post-traumatic stress disorder certainly was a very real factor for those that were being deported. Families were deported. Here you can see an Egyptian family being deported from Memphis. That's Memphis, Egypt, not Tennessee. Here you can see deportees being stopped along the way to give them sustenance. And once again, they were deported to the three places that the Bible, in fact, lists. And we have all kinds of evidence describing this. And I'm going to have to fly through this. I'm kind of sorry, but I have other things I want to talk about. So those that received preferred treatment were military. Military folk often received extra special treatment. And one of these is found in what's called a horse list. And this block that I have blocked out here is a list of 13 individuals who are identified in the text in this line right there as Sumerians. And they are 13 charioteers, Israelite charioteers, that have been incorporated into Sargon II's army. And they are given rations here in this text. This is just illustrating chariots. Officials were also sometimes treated in marvelous ways. Many of these would have been located in Kalku, which was the capital city of the day, and that was located on this is the Euphrates, the Tigris River. Here is Kalku, and it looks like this. And this is actually the main mound that has obviously been excavated considerably over the years, and the palace would have looked something like this. So this would have been the place where some Israelites were actually serving in high court positions. Priests, we know of priests, we can track some of them as well, including priestly singers and some guys doing some music as well. They're being deported. Skilled laborers were needed for building projects, particularly the building of Dur Sharukin. Sargon II wanted to build a new capital, and so he did this, and we can see that many of these skilled laborers received actually double portions. They got a special ration of food. When we go and look a little bit further, this is where Dur Sharukin is located, modern Khorsabad, just to the north and east of Nineveh. This is what the University of Chicago excavations projected the site looked like in that day, and the gate entrance to it that some of the skilled laborers no doubt worked on. Merchants, landowners, these would be others that would have special treatment, and then we know of some witnesses in contracts, and these individuals also receive great treatment. But then there were deportees that received hardship and bare subsistence. And so agricultural workers would be one. Here's some hard labor going on in the fields. Forced laborers, these would have been used to build in construction. We actually have a letter that documents Israelites receiving this bare minimum, 1 ka, that's 1 liter of grain per day, which will keep you alive, but you will not do well just on that amount. Here you can see some hard labor going on. We can also see here that some were sent to frontline border towns. This would have been the cities of the Medes, and this would have been a very tough area to live and survive as well. Slaves, debtors, we have many, many records. You can see this guy right here, unquestionably an Israelite with the name here. He has wives who are involved in this particular deal. Here we have an Israelite woman who is testified to in a text. So there are quite a number of these. And again, some of these, because of the date that these texts are dated, they could possibly be Judahites. I cannot say absolutely that they are Israelites. Now, Judahites in Neo-Assyrian sources, we can see that, first of all, we have a tablet dated to 660 BC, and this particular debt that was incurred by this man, who received from a man by the name of Aduni-Ak. This is undoubtedly a Hebrew name. It could possibly be Phoenician, but I think it's very likely otherwise. 3 homers of wheat, but it's done by the Judahite seah. This is a measure. You can see the length of the amount of grain measured that this is, and this was part of the loan. So we know this man was a Judahite because he's using this seah. I told you that in some cases we might be able to trace Judahites in the archaeological record. Here you can see a little dark, but these guys have a special headdress. And we can see that this group, this gang right here, also has that same special headdress. And here you can see a close-up of that headdress. This is a very likely identification of Judahites in Assyrian records through this kind of record. Dominique Colon has argued this in an article of 2005. Here we can see a royal guard also with this same headdress that is being worn. Judahites in Neo-Babylonian sources, okay? So a few words on this. Here is the famous Ishtar Gate of Nineveh in the Berlin Museum. Here is a reconstruction of what Babylon looked like in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. And you can see the Ishtar Gate here. And this has been reproduced in many cases. So Judahite deportations. There were 4 of these. If you take Daniel 1:1 seriously and consider it to be historically accurate, then there is a deportation of at least a few folk in 605 BC. And then a major deportation, however, takes place in 598, 597. This is Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, together with the king's mother, wives, officials, etc. About 13,000 people were taken into captivity at this time. Then the fall of Jerusalem, we have a deportation of 832 persons. Many others were executed at this point. I want to add that this number, we tend to think that number is absolutely accurate, but that is simply Jeremiah listing people, and that may be simply a number of particular elites and not necessarily the whole lot. And need to keep that in mind. And finally, there was a further deportation in 582. The Babylonian Chronicle happens to chronicle this particular event in 598, and this is a copy of that. We know that quite a number of these Judahites end up in places identified along with other deportees. The Assyrians did one kind of deportation. Nuclear families stay together, everything else you assimilate. Whereas the Babylonians do not force that. And in fact, we can see here that there was a house of Tyrians. This is a place name. This is an actual place near Nippur in Babylonia. Sidon, Ashkelon, these are Philistines that have been taken there. A house of Hamatians, some Arabs, and then finally, and most recently, there has come to light a place called Al, that is the city, that is the word for city, Yehuda, that is Judah. And so we now have a group of texts actually from this site. So right in, here is good old Babylon on the Euphrates River. Here is Nippur, and we have this Al Yehuda, the city of Judah, located somewhere in this area. I've put it slightly to the north, but we actually don't know exactly where it was in relation to Nippur. In any case, the identification of Judahite persons in Neo-Babylonian sources works the same way that we have in Assyrian sources, only the cuneiform spelling is slightly different because Babylonian dialect is different from Assyrian dialect. Okay? And so the front end, the way of writing looks very similar to the Assyrian, but the back end absolutely different, because the Ma actually stands for Wa, and hence this is the spelling of the Yahvistic theophoric in the Neo-Babylonian script. And so an example of this can be seen here. Akiyama is actually Akiyahu, and this is how you write that name in Neo-Babylonian. So again, we can identify these individuals. We also, then Judahites in Neo-Babylonian sources, first of all, Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin, the actual individual deported in 598, 597, is attested in a ration text. Okay? And as a result, I'm not going to obviously read all of this, but you can see here in the very first part, it is, that's how you write Jehoiachin's name in Neo-Babylonian, and he's actually identified as the king of Judah, along with a number of other Judahites that are there with him. Okay? So this is what the cuneiform text actually looks like. This is then the transliteration and translation. We again have evidence of individuals from Nippur. In fact, in the city of Nippur, excavations uncovered a whole group of texts that attest to a business firm, a Jewish business firm. This is a three-generation of family attested here in these documents. They were involved in the banking, in particular in estate management, and the archive gives information on not only their lives, but also about another 100 Jewish families that are there in the city of Nippur and the surrounding area. And they leased lots, did all kinds of business deals of various sorts. And again, we can trace them. The first generation has Hebrew names. Second generation start having Neo-Babylonian names. And once again, here is Nippur, and there is then also a place called Zippor, just north of Babylon, another set of Jewish folk that we can trace there. And I've actually laid out for you their family tree. And we can actually trace them, and you can see that these are two brothers. This is another brother, and then this is a fourth brother. And you can see here that they have Hebrew names. In fact, this is Mardukah. That's actually a Babylonian name that we have in the Bible as, of course, good old Mordecai. And so this is an example of what I'm talking about. But then here is another Hebrew name. He marries, the italic here is women, and he marries a Babylonian, and then he has children with her. We can trace some of them, and a daughter who marries another Babylonian. So, in conclusion, I want to say this real quick, and that is that we have a brand new set of these texts that have been just published literally just 2 weeks ago. And I have not had my hands on it, but I have Lori Pierce let me have a look at some of the material. It's an outstanding study and will only broaden our understanding of Jews in Babylonia down through the Persian period. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, Jim Hoffmeier up next.
My focus is really going to be on the Egyptian side of what you have just been introduced to. And the first couple slides are really biblical texts which talk about the fall of Jerusalem in the book of 2 Kings 24 and 25, and then parallel passages in the book of Jeremiah. We are all familiar with the deportation of the Jews, the Judeans, to Babylon that we've just been hearing about, and also some of the Israelites even before then going back to the Assyrian period. What I want to focus on is probably another side of the story that most people aren't aware of, and that is the movement of Judeans in the southerly direction to Egypt. Now, do we need a password? Now, having said this means I can slip through the first couple slides and still stick to my 45-minute limit, right?
Yeah, you're halfway through your time, though.
Okay. Yeah. It's really funny. Gary and Rabbi Ben, I renamed the second edition of my program last night, so it's 2. The title is Jews in Exile - Houston. It says 2 Jews in Exile in Houston. I hope you guys feel at home here. as I do. We don't want to drop box. You can just kill that. Okay. All right. Here we go. We're in business. Excellent. Okay. All right. So, Judeans in Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The passages I was just talking about in 2 Kings that we're familiar with. And after the mass deportation of 586, when the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, through the agent of his general Nebuzaradan, placed a Judean official as the governor of Egypt, or governor of Judah, and his name was Gedaliah. And the seal actually has the name of Gedaliah, servant of the king. Whether or not it's our Gedaliah or not, we don't know. But after 7 months, this Gedaliah was assassinated, and this created great fear amongst the Judeans who were of the remnant. There were those who feared, rightly so, that when you kill off the Babylonian appointed governor, you're going to be visited upon by Nebuchadnezzar's armies. And so a group of them decide, we're getting out of here. And this is what 2 Kings 25:26 says. Then all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. And meanwhile, just prior to that, if you read in Jeremiah chapter 40, you will learn that Jeremiah was one of the exiles being taken to Babylon. When they arrived a little bit north of Jerusalem, it came to the attention of Nebuzaradan who this man was, and he was released. And Jeremiah then returns to the Gedaliah group before his assassination at Mizpah, which turned out to be the sort of capital of the little struggling province of Judah after the destruction of Jerusalem. So it was from there that this group decides to go to Egypt, and I won't get into all of that, but there's a long discussion of this in Jeremiah 41, 42, 43. And then we read that this group came to Egypt. And they came to the land of Egypt, for they did not obey the voice of the Lord, which Jeremiah had spoken to them. They arrived at Tahpanhes, which the name has actually survived in the classical sources as Daphne, and in the Arabic as Tel Dafina. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah in Tahpanhes, and I'm going to skip over this. It's a long quotation, but basically to say, you all think you came here to get away from Nebuchadnezzar. Ha ha, he's coming to Egypt. You're not getting away from him. Chapter 44, verse 1 is really quite interesting. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah concerning the Judeans who lived in the land of Egypt. And it reads, who lived, and the reason I put that in red is most of our translations do not have that there. Who lived in the land of Egypt, and then you have this line repeated, who lived, and then it specifies where they were living. Now, the year is about 585, 584 BC, so we're within a year and a half after the fall of Jerusalem, and we find out that you already have Judeans living at Migdol, at Tahpanhes, where Jeremiah was speaking, at Memphis, and in the land of Pathros. And it goes on to talk about Nebuchadnezzar's coming and how he's going to destroy the obelisks of Heliopolis and the temples of Egypt, etc. Now, archaeologically, in the last 20 years or so, much has come to light on this period of Egyptian history we call the Saite period. This is the period when the city of Sais in the western delta became the dominant city of the northern part of Egypt. And during this Saite period, we find, and these red dots all represent fortifications and cities that were built during the Saite period. And we'll look a little more closely at these, but you can see this line, and this really does comport to the geographical realities of the situation in Egypt at that time, which don't have time to get into. Here you can see on this map from Anson Rainey's wonderful atlas what we're talking about there. You can see Migdol, Tahpanhes in the delta, Memphis at the base of the delta, and then the word Pathros is used. Pathros is actually the Egyptian expression which means the Southland. It doesn't specifically mention Aswan or Sien or Elephantine, the very southern part of Egypt. However, Ezekiel 29 does mention the geographical parameters of Egypt as going from Migdol to Sien, or modern-day Aswan, at the very bottom of the slide, and we'll take a look there a little bit later on today. Now, I want to do a little bit on some of the archaeology of this area, because the red box, some of you will know this was the area where we were investigating in the past decade, quite extensively. This is a Corona satellite image of this area from the 1960s, but I want to draw your attention to this little square dot, a square box. This is the site of T21, or Tel Kedwa as it's known in Arabic, and this was excavated in detail by Eliezer Oren in the 1970s. But you can see the movement across this diagonal parcel of land, and the other red dots represent sites from the Saite period, including a very large fort at that lower left-hand dot at the site of Tel Hebwa, a very large Saite period fort. But let's focus on the site at Kedwa. Here is the plan of this fort. It was built in the late 7th century and continued to about 500 BC. Apparently, it may have sustained sufficient damage during the Persian invasion that it was abandoned after that. There is a small trench excavated here in 1993 by Donald Redford, who is my professor, and more work has been done at the site since by Egyptians, so you can actually see the casements of the wall of this site. Now, it was Oren who actually suggested, and I think he's right, and most people agree with him, that this site is the site of Migdol. This was Egypt's Saite period, 7th century frontier fort. This guarded the way into Egypt. This was the Migdol that is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah and the book of Ezekiel. Interestingly, Oren did discover at the site Judean type pottery, which he suggests there was some sort of direct contact with Judean centers, or it may actually signal the presence of Judeans. I think both are possible. As I said, this site flourished for a little over 100 years. Massive fort, about 40,000 square feet, a big military fort to guard Egypt's entry point. Here you can see in the foreground the excavations at Tel Kedwa, or Migdol, and off in the distance you can see on the horizon another tell or a mound popping up, and that is just a little over a mile away, and this is the site of Tel El Hair. This fort, this site actually becomes the inheritor, the successor site to the nearby Tel Kedwa. So from the Persian period through the Greco-Roman period, this site was known in Greek texts as Magdala. So it preserves the ancient Semitic name Migdol, which, by the way, is the same name for an even earlier fort that goes back to the period of the Exodus and the period of the Ramesses. There was a fort here. The site continues to be excavated by our French colleagues, Dominique Valbel and her team. And what's interesting is that Migdol is specifically said, and by the way, that's Migdol Kedwa, is specifically said to have Judeans living in it when Jeremiah arrived. Now, we know there were Judeans at this fort because we actually have a letter sent by one of the soldiers, and he is writing to his father in southern Egypt at Elephantine Island, over 600 miles away, complaining that he has not been getting his rations and his clothes, and would you please send me some clothes? It's cold up here, unlike Aswan where it's very hot, and he's grumbling at his dad. And anyway, let me just read part of this. Greetings to the temple of Yahweh, but it's Yahoo in the text. These are written in Aramaic, in Elephantine. We know from these texts, and I'll show you archaeologically, there was a temple of Yahweh built in Elephantine Island. And he goes on to say, now from the day that you went out from Egypt, that's the translation, the word is actually Pathros. They use the same term for southern Egypt that Jeremiah uses. He said that how we complained to the officials about the allotment here in Migdol. So this letter originated in Migdol by a Judean soldier. So there were Judeans probably, as when Jeremiah arrived, there were already Judean soldiers. When did they get there? It may be as early as the death of Josiah, when the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II took the successor, Shallum, or Jehoahaz II as his throne name, took him back to Egypt and perhaps a contingent of soldiers and so on. But from this time on, there seems to be a regular Judean presence in Egypt. Interestingly, as Dr. Younger's presentation showed us, the Assyrians and the Babylonian successors thought very pragmatically. You guys are soldiers? Good, we have a place for you to work. Oh, you're builders? We have a place for you to work. So it's not unlikely that those who were professionally soldiers in their previous life in Judah now became soldiers in Egypt or mercenaries. And the Egyptians at this period were noted for their mercenary foreign army. By the way, Jeremiah knows about it. He talks about it in Jeremiah chapter 46. Now, as regards to the site of Tel Daphne or Daphina, what you're looking at here is a rather interesting satellite image on the left, and then an architectural plan of the site based on the right. Now, if you go back to over 100 years ago, the area marked there in that little box was excavated by Petrie, and he was absolutely convinced that what he had found was this major fortification, and that this was a military site founded by Psammiticus I, the great Psamtik I. And ever since then, I've checked literature all the way up till just a few years ago, and this is said to be the major military site of the Saite period in the north. Now, with these new satellite images, you can actually see the outline of a very large temple, and there you see it on the right. And around this big temple and administrative complex was a large wall, which Petrie knew about. And here you can see it on the right in the plan. So as of 2009, there's been a publication by Geoffrey Spencer from the British Museum, along with Francois Leclerc, who now excavates Tanis, and our Egyptian colleagues, and they're now saying this was not a major military site. Petrie got it wrong. He based it all on this little area that he dug. It is a major temple site, administrative center. Yes, there would have been military there, but the whole nature of this site is now being rethought, and the literature is saying it's very different. But one thing Jeremiah seems to be saying, and perhaps what this little area Petrie dug at the center of the site, Jeremiah referred to it as the house of the king, the king's palace. And so probably that's where the palace was located and where Jeremiah and his colleagues would have spent a little time. But interesting to note, this major administrative center with soldiers, with temples, etc., also had Judeans in them when Jeremiah arrived. Now let's go to Elephantine Island. And Elephantine Island is part of what we call the first cataract. You'll notice the right side of the Nile, there's this grayish color. It's actually pink granite that protrudes through the sandstone natural rock of the area, thus forming this cataract in the Nile. At the very top of this is where Elephantine Island is. And here was Egypt's southern frontier, and from time immemorial there were forts located here to defend Egypt from the Nubian aggressors to the south. Elephantine Island was the domain of the ram-headed god Khnum, and there was a major temple to Khnum. And here there was a major Jewish colony of mercenaries who lived, and literally hundreds and thousands of Aramaic papyri have been found, which tell us about the lives of the Jews who lived on this island. And we have entire archives of certain families. And I'm going to read from this particular text. It's interesting. This is a marriage contract between a man named Hananiah and his wife Tammuz. And they married in 449 BC in the 16th year of Artaxerxes I. And like we saw with the previous presentation, there are witnesses on this document, and almost all the names are Hebrew. So we have Nathan, the son of Hananiah, wrote this document. So he's the scribe. And the witnesses were Nathan, Gadul, Menachem, son of Zakur, Gemariah, the son of Mahasiah. Some of the very names we find in the period of Jeremiah. We also have a deed of manumission. My wife was spelling my everything last night, checking my spelling. Says, "What's that?" So that's a word you may not know, but that's for the release of a slave. When you write a decree releasing somebody from their slavery obligations. As it turns out, the wife of Hananiah was actually bound to another man in the community, and here they release her in the year 427, 20 years after they've been married, which is the 38th year of Artaxerxes I. And we read, at that time, Meshullam, the son of Zakur, a Judean or Jew of Elephantine fortress and of the military unit, etc., etc. So this man was connected to the military. And again, Haggai wrote this document. Haggai, good name we all know in the Bible, of Elephantine, at the dictation of Meshullam, etc. But one of the witnesses happens to be a Mede. So you do get this sort of ethnic mix of the peoples of that part of the world. One other thing we learn about this interesting family, Hananiah, and they must have lived a long and happy life, because here they are about to sell their house and downscale to a small apartment somewhere. And here they are 47 years after their marriage, downsizing and selling their house to their son-in-law. And things haven't changed. In any event, why this is interesting on a number of levels, one of which we learn is that Hananiah is an official connected to the temple. He actually has some sort of official priestly title. And in this deed of sale, we have a description of the house, its size, and it's very interesting because it gives us the layout of the little Judean community there. On the west of it, the house is the temple of Yahoo. So west of the house is the temple. And the street is the King Street. So we named the main drag. Above it is the house of, and so on. And it tells you the names of all the neighbors. And they're all Jewish names, or Hebrew names. So we can put together the life of this community. And so on the top there is what we call the Jewish sector. And beside it is the temple of Yahweh. It's actually been excavated only in recent years, although we've known about it from texts for quite a long time. And this map is perhaps a little more helpful because you can see here on the left is a section of the temple, as has been found, made of mud brick. And we have the residence of Khnum city, and then the temple of Khnum just off to the side here. All right, I want to take you to one more thing, and with that, well, two more things, and I'll close. According to this, I've gone 19 minutes.
According to this, you've gone 20 minutes, 53 seconds.
All right. There is a site in northern part of Egypt, just north of Cairo, called Tel al-Yahudiya, which means the Mound of the Jews, not surprisingly, because there a temple was built by one Jewish priest named Onias III, who fled from the Seleucid king Antiochus. He fled from Jerusalem, came to Egypt. The Ptolemaic kings were very happy to have a disgruntled person from the Seleucid realm, and he was apparently given a contingent of soldiers, and according to Josephus, he built a temple. This temple was discovered archaeologically in the 1880s, early 1880s, by Edward Naville, and then in 1905, Petrie did more work there, and I'm going along rather quickly. But Josephus describes it as in the Heliopolitan Nome, right where we are. He built a fortress and a temple, and so on. What you're looking at here is, in the foreground is the Hyksos period rampart from the 17th century BC, and that mound over the top is the mound on which this Jewish temple was built by Onias. And here is Petrie's plan. And right there in the red is where this temple was built. Now, I've never really looked into it all that much, but I did it for this presentation, and I'm amazed by what we see. You actually have a tripartite temple, just like the Solomon's temple and the Herodian temples of Jerusalem, with the double pillars and the porch area, the inner court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The other things that shocked me is that Petrie published these few little fragments from this temple, and they look very much like the type of important architecture that we have from Judah and Megiddo and elsewhere in Israel. So it looks like this temple is really trying to replicate Solomon's temple architecturally in a number of ways. Petrie found this wall with embossed ashlars. Again, this is nothing we're accustomed to seeing in Egypt, but if you are in Israel or Phoenicia, then you're very familiar with this type of architecture. So it seems that this temple, built around 150 BC, that continued all the way down to 1 year after the Temple of Jerusalem was built, destroyed in AD 70, this temple flourished in Egypt. Well, I'm going to skip over this Jewish. Let me just end with a rather interesting new discovery. Jeremiah refers to Nebuchadnezzar as a lion has gone forth from its thicket, a destroyer of nations has set out, to describe Nebuchadnezzar. And I want to take you, well, I'm going to skip over this very quickly because up till now, the only known clear identifiable destruction from Nebuchadnezzar's invasion was this part of this residential area, Tel el-Maskuta, discovered in 1979 by Jack Holliday. In 2011, at Tel Dafina, this partially, well, it's mostly preserved, but part of it's missing, as you can see, is a large stela of the pharaoh Apries or Hafra. And it's dated to year 7. And year 7 works out to be the year 582 BC. 582 BC correlates with the very year that Nebuchadnezzar's armies came and did a mop-up operation after the death of Gedaliah. This is the first reference we have, according to Dominique Valbel, textually. The Bible doesn't talk about it. The Babylonian Chronicle doesn't talk about it. The first time we actually have indications of a Babylonian invasion, and it correlates with the very year that Nebuchadnezzar came to Judah, or Nebuchadnezzar's armies came to Judah. So this is just a new text discovered in 2011 and published last year. So this refers to Opry's preparing for military attacks against the Asiatics, and that has to be the Chaldeans. So we began with Jeremiah's promise that Nebuchadnezzar was coming to Egypt, and now we actually have some sort of evidence that he did come, and there to encounter both Egyptians and perhaps some of the very Judeans who fled Jerusalem were there on the front lines fighting to try to keep him out. Thank you.
Pottery, small finds, and inscriptions identified as having Edomite characteristics have been found in a number of late Iron II sites in the Judean Negev. And these sites, in fact, extend from Tel El Khalifa in the south to the land of Gerar in the west, to Tel Arad in the north, and to En Hatzeva in the east. And you have your maps there so you can draw on those and follow. Often I think you come along to these things and you think, where on earth is he talking about? So you've got your little handout there. Now, a number of scholars believe that these finds indicate an Edomite political takeover in the northern Negev, a kind of aggressive policy to take over and wrest control of the trade route that ran through the Beersheba-Arad Valley, while Judah was preoccupied with the punitive attacks from the Neo-Babylonians and the siege of Jerusalem. Now, by contrast, there are other scholars who maintain that these finds indicate nothing more than simple, peaceful penetration. Sorry, the light is really in my eyes. I'm going over here. That's better. I can see you all now. Okay, so they believe that this is a peaceful penetration. It's nothing more than caravans just moving through the area and people settling down from Edom to have a livelihood. Well, anyway, the purpose of my dissertation, and this is a very much reduced version of which you can see the larger version on the seat over there, was to answer the question, did the Edomites annex southern Judah in any political sense and occupy the area during the Neo-Babylonian reduction of Judah in the early 6th century? Now, Beit Uriah was perhaps the most vociferous exponent and prolific writer for this aggressive Edomite incursion. And his 2007 publication, A Horvat Uzzah and Horvat Radam, highlights and nicely sums up his views. In the first place, he believes that the fortification of the eastern Negev in the mid-7th century forms a defensive ring to stop the penetration of Edomites into the area. Secondly, there's the establishment of the Edomite sanctuary at Horvat Kitmit, which we will look at in a bit. And this was to provide for the cultic needs of the Edomite population that were moving into the area. Then we have an abundance of Edomite artifacts, which suggest a settled rather than a nomadic population. Things like pottery, cultic vessels, Edomite inscriptions. They all indicate, according to Beit Uriah, a cultural level uncharacteristic of any nomadic tribes that you would expect to find. Then we have the deep hatred in the Bible towards Edom. And this was an expression, he believes, of this incursion that Edom made into Judah. And finally, there's the Ostracon number 24, which expresses a fear of an Edomite invasion into the eastern Judah. Therefore, this paper is a summary of my 2010 doctoral thesis, of which I examined all these different aspects. Now, my investigation included a survey of all the archaeological sites in the area, and they're all dotted down on your list, and there's a little table there to help. Also, I looked to see if there was a link between Kos and Edom, and Kos is traditionally believed to be the chief Edomite deity, so I had to investigate all of that and see if his name was perhaps significant. And then a study of the prophetic books, the Hebrew Bible, to see what, if anything, they could offer in this debate, and moreover, to answer the question, why were the Judahites and Yahweh felt so aggrieved with Edom? What had Edom done to warrant such anger? So, let's look at Edom and the prophets first. So, we can start by examining briefly the Old Testament prophets. We soon discover that the prophets' hatred for Edom was out of all proportion for any of the other surrounding nations. Think of any of the other nations. They didn't come in for it as much as Edom did. So, some have suggested that the reason for this is that Edom stood as a symbol for the nations. It was like code for the nations. A little bit like we think of Babylon in the book of Revelation, standing for Rome and for all bad cities and bad government. Okay. However, that all the texts cited, I think out of all of those that I looked at, only Isaiah 34 and 63 actually had any merit for suggesting that Edom stood for the nations. Basically, in the rest of them, Edom was Edom. And even then in Isaiah, he's using the word Edom, and comparing it with Adam, meaning blood. It's a wordplay which I think is particular to Isaiah. So if we think of Edom, and we think of it being condemned because of the hostile activities, okay, then it wouldn't be unusual to think that. The events on the surface seem to merit such condemnation. However, when you look at it and read it closely, the prophets, by and large, condemned Edom for its attitude rather than for any of its specific attitudes that it had done. And moreover, it still doesn't explain the heightened invective towards Edom. I mean, other nations, Babylon, for example, had destroyed the temple. So why is Edom still getting more of the heat? Now, that's not to say that Edom was not involved in armed violence against Judah. I mean, it certainly was. And they stopped and handed over Judahites who were trying to escape at the crossroads and handing them back to the Neo-Babylonians. And furthermore, Ezekiel 35 seems to suggest that the Edomites actually took over certain areas. They certainly coveted it and thought about moving in. And this is again corroborated in the book of Obadiah. Yet the precise area that they took is not mentioned. There is no location mentioned in the prophets or anywhere in the Bible that they might have taken over. They've just got their greedy eyes on Judah. However, due to the location of where Edom is and where Judah is, the northeastern Negev would seem to be the place that they were moving into. Now, as I was looking at this and thinking these things over, I came across a very intriguing suggestion by a guy called Eliasis. Now, he says it was not Edom's participation in the destruction or even their annexation of some parts of Judah that led to the exceptional attitude towards Edom in the prophetic text. It was not what had been done, rather it was who had done it. It was Edom, and who was Edom? It was a fear. It was the ideological and theological significance of who Edom was, that Judah assigned to Edom's actions, that led the prophets to focus on Edom. It was the fear that Yahweh was reversing that birthright in Esau's favor that had to be addressed. And you get that very intriguing bit in Malachi. He says, how have I loved you? Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Who's worried about Esau? Why are they asking the questions about Esau? Well, Eliasis thinks it's got something to do with them taking over the land, this reversal of this birthright. So in summary, the Old Testament says very little that can conclusively indicate that Edom annexed the northern Negev during the Neo-Babylonian period. Nonetheless, if Assis is right, and I think he's onto something here, it's about the feared birthright reversal in favor of Esau. Then the loss of the land to Edom will play no small part in that anxiety. It's perhaps significant that in 5 of the oracles that are mentioned, pronouncements of doom are mentioned in connection with pronouncements of blessing upon Judah. So where Edom is being condemned, Judah is being blessed again. They seem to work in tandem. Now, let's move on to the material culture. But before we look at the material culture of the sites, we need to ascertain what it is that we're looking for and why we're looking for it. So, in general, it has been accepted that Kos was the name of the chief Edomite god. And therefore, it would seem reasonable that one of the proposed indicators for identifying an Edomite presence at a given site would be the discovery of inscriptions containing the name Kos. And there's some there, and the Hebrew didn't come out thanks to Apple. But if you can read Paleo-Hebrew, that says Kos. Okay then. So looking for these inscriptions, either the deity's name, as it is there, or as a theophoric compound of a personal name, which would suggest maybe it's an Edomite with a Kos name, like we saw earlier with the Jehudahite theophorics that Lawson was pointing out. There's much I'd love to say about Kos, and I've given the whole papers on Kos and things like that, but time prevents me, so we shall move along. So, let's look at the Edomite pottery. And one of the more distinctive features of Edomite material culture is their lovely decorated ware. Okay, this decoration is most commonly in the form of black and sometimes coloured bands. Painted decoration, in fact, occurs on all types of pottery except for cooking pots and lamps. The decorations are mainly lines and bands, and the most common types of decoration are in arrangement of concentric horizontal lines and bands. There are other types as well, with zigzags, triangles, and things like that. And the most common forms of plastic, that is where they've actually made some mouldings into the clay, that is found in this decorated ware, is this denticulated fringe on the rim of certain bowls and tall pot stands. So such triangular denticulation, in fact, is considered indicative of Edomite vessels. So if you're in any charity shops and you see anything like this, you'll know you're looking at Edomite ware. Now, some scholars have in the past perhaps overzealously interpreted the mere presence of this ethnically defined decorated pottery at a given site as evidence for the occupation of a particular group. But if you look at these examples of the distribution of Philistine ware, of which you can't actually, all the dots where they are, and the Midianite ware, no one for 1 minute is suggesting that this was the occupation and this is where the Philistines all went to. Often this kind of decorated ware is high-end, tradable, high-value goods like your Wedgwood ware and all your nice antiques. People would like a bit of that, thank you very much. You're going to trade it. It's not the stuff you eat off every day. So we have to be very cautious about how we interpret these nice decorated wares. So, foodways and food are becoming increasingly recognised as a means of identifying differing ethnic groups. And there are many anthropological studies that now look into food. And they concluded that dietary patterns tend to be very conservative, symbols of ethnicity, in that foodways are the most resistant to change by certain people groups. Food is considered one of the primary symbols of cultural identity and group solidarity. It certainly was in my grandparents' day. I mean, these days we tend to eat whatever we like. Unfortunately, the faunal remains that we found from these respective sites are few and far between. However, the limited picture that does emerge from a comparison of the faunal remains and the botanical remains indicate that there was little significant difference between the two sites. People's diets either in Edom or the Beersheba Arad Valley. It appears that the kind of animals that the various people groups ate are in the main based on ecological and socio-economic conditions. The diet appears just to be typical of the sort of stuff that you can buy in the shops in those kind of areas. But notwithstanding this conclusion, further recording of faunal remains might help clarify this picture, although I'm not going to hold my breath. In spite of this lack of no difference between the different sites, it is possible that we might be able to distinguish in the different people groups through looking at cooking pots. Cooking pots are now considered perhaps the subtlest indicator of the presence of direct influence on a distinct cultural group. People are most comfortable using the style of vessel with which they learnt to cook. The shape and the material of the cooking pot appears to reflect a certain culinary tradition. Therefore, we discover an Edomite cooking pot in southeastern Judah. It begs the question, why would anybody, other than an Edomite, want to make a cooking pot that is typologically the same as the sort that you find in Edom? The distinguishing feature that I see that labels these cooking pots as Edomite appears to be a distinctive lip at the top of the pot there. It could be that they had a lid on, but no one's ever said that they've ever found any of these lids. It doesn't seem to add anything to the cooking pot, so why not just use a Judahite cooking pot? The other question it begs is, for what market were these Edomite-style cooking pots used if they were just trade items? So let's turn and see what the southern Judah sites have to offer. So, in the far west, the site in the region of Gira, Tel Serah, Tel Haror, and Tel Gemma appear to have already been destroyed by one of the Sayat dynasty's pharaohs in the middle of the second half of the 7th century BC, long before the proposed Edomite occupation. Looking at the destruction layers, that's when they met their end. Edomite ceramic finds are very few and far between, and they're devoid of any cooking pots. The picture suggests that the Edomite remains found in these particular sites were imported by trade. Then, in the far south, we have Tel El Khalifa. This appears already to have been under Edomite control before the beginning of the 6th century, and the Deuteronomist records that. Now, it says that Elat was recovered for Syria, but it's probably a typo, and it should read Edom. Aram and Edom in the Hebrew look very similar. The pottery assemblages there, 75% Edomite cooking pots, and epigraphic material. This is the Kos Arnol seal handles, and these appeared on a lot of pots and things down there, Kos being the Edomite god appearing in that. However, when Tel El Khalifa was destroyed is less certain. We're not sure when it was destroyed. The pottery typology and the paleography of the forms of writing means it's possible that it could have carried on to the end of the 6th century. If this is the case, then I'm proposing the best candidate for this destruction would be Nabonidus, one of the last Babylonian kings, as part of his campaign to conquer and occupy Timur in Arabia in 552. So, the case for who controlled En-Hatsiva and when, again, is not clear. This is compounded by the contradictory reports, and some of which are unpublished, which makes it all very difficult. Now, maybe they've been published since I wrote this, but I haven't seen those yet. Maybe someone could tell me. There's been much written on the cultic remains there, and often in the popular press, these are the things that you'll read about. If it were an Edomite shrine, it's surprising that we find no mention of the god Kos there, but however, we should bear in mind no mention of any gods were mentioned there. The only link to suggest that this is possibly an Edomite cultic place is the similarities between some cultic-type heads found at Busira in Edom, and also these ones that were found at Kitmit, which I will demonstrate later, I think is Edomite. So they're a bit similar. The pottery found there, although not in a stratified context, was also Edomite, and these were Edomite cooking pots. So given En-Hatsiva's geographical location, Tel El Khalifa to the south, Busira and Taliwan, which are Edomites just across the board, and the pottery assemblage, it seems highly likely that it was the Edomites who were in control, if not before the destruction of Jerusalem, certainly afterwards. En-Hatsiva is just too far south to have been well maintained and garrisoned by Judah in this particular period. Nearby Givat Hatsiva, which isn't on the map, presents a similar picture of Edomite pottery. In the southwest, Kadesh Barnea was destroyed at the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 6th century. It seems strange that this important fortified settlement, and staging area was not resettled until the 4th or 5th century. And even then, it was not refortified. Kadesh Barnea would have acted as a staging post for Judah's ally, Egypt. And they do find these hieratic ostracon. Now, there is some discussion as to whether they just used hieratic because it was an easier way to write numbers. than it was in Hebrew, a little bit like we use Arabic numerals today rather than Roman numerals. But there seems to be some Egyptian connection perhaps there. If this was destroyed, it was destroyed like a fire break to stop the Egyptians using it as a forward staging base before then moving up further into the Levant. So, turning to the Beersheba Arad Valley and its environs, the following may be observed. Tel Arad, the most likely sequence of destruction is that Strata 8 was destroyed in 701 BC during Sennacherib's campaign. Strata 7 was destroyed then late in the 7th century BC, probably by Pharaoh Necho. And Strata 6 was destroyed in the early 6th century, probably by the Neo-Babylonians. However, this may have continued until Nabonidus' campaign. We're not too sure, the pottery typology is so similar. But nonetheless, the Edomite pottery in both destruction levels was negligible, which suggests that the Edomites never bothered occupying it anyway. Now, one of the intriguing things is this ostraca inscription number 40, which, as I said, Beta Ria makes quite a thing about. Unfortunately, this was found in a non-stratified context, so when this actual dialogue took place and what it refers to is difficult to know. But the main thing is that the king of Judah should know that we cannot send the whatever it is, and it talks about the evil that Edom has done, although has done has been reconstructed. So we're not really sure what the evil was that Edom was doing or when they were doing it. So as intriguing as it might be, we can't put a whole lot of store on this one, ostraca. Nearby Horvat Tov also records no Edomite finds. So Beersheba 2 did not contain, Beersheba 2 did contain the Edomite pottery. Unfortunately, this was destroyed by Sennacherib in 701. And Beersheba 1 contained no Edomite finds. So again, the Edomites weren't in Beersheba at that particular time. In fact, intriguingly, by the 4th century, there are a number of Aramaic ostraca that are found there with Kos Theophorix on it, as in the 4th century they'd found Arad as well, which are attached to the Idumeans. But yeah, the Edomites weren't there in the intervening period, and it doesn't seem to indicate when this was resettled. So then we have Horvat Uzzah. This was destroyed sometime between the end of the 7th and the beginning of the 6th century BC, and the Judahite pottery and the Hebrew ostraca suggest that Judah was still in control when it fell. There is a baffling composition of Edomite cooking pots. So there's Edomite cooking pots, there's Judahite cooking pots, and there's also coastal Philistine-type cooking pots there. And it's a big mix match of these pots. It may suggest that Edom and Philistia were working with Judah at the time of its destruction. There might have been a mercenary garrison there or something. And when we read, there's an inscription there, in inscription number 7 in the Edomite ostraca that talks about, there's the different cooking pots, Said Lumelech to Bubble, are you well? I bless you by Kos. So there's this interchange between somebody who's blessing somebody by the Edomite god, but it seems to be still a Judahite garrison. So the picture's a bit confused here at this place. But certainly, according to Jeremiah 27:3, Edom felt politically inclined enough to send envoys to Jerusalem at Zedekiah's behest to discuss an anti-Babylonian coalition. So they could have been working together. However, they were probably astute enough to jump ship when events began to unfold. And nonetheless, the evidence suggests that it's unlikely that Edom ever occupied this site following the collapse of Judah. There was no more remains in there. And Horvat Radum, which was just down the road from there, follows the same picture. So then we get the pottery assemblage. That's Horvat Tov. So Tel Era. The pottery assemblage from Tel Era Strata 7 appears to have been destroyed again in 701 during Sennacherib's campaign. Strata 6 was destroyed at some time during the 6th century. Whoever destroyed Tel Era would have had considerable military technology to go up that hill. It is quite a formidable thing, and the Edomites probably just were not going to be up to doing that. Furthermore, there was only a few shards of Edomite and coastal cooking pots that were actually found in that final destruction layer, and it was probably destroyed by the Neo-Babylonians in about 586. At Tel Aroa, that was destroyed some point in the 6th century, but it was difficult to be more precise. There are lots of confusing reports about this, but there were mixed assemblages of Edomite and coastal and Judahite vessels there, and it's kind of a bit of a cosmopolitan place there. And the people that have recently published the data on this place think that it was a caravanserai, this sort of trade place that was going on. So it's not clear what was going on there at Tel Aroa, whether the Edomites continued with that or not. Then we get Tel Massos. So Tel Massos does not have any Edomite assemblage that would suggest an Edomite occupation. There's an absence of all cooking pots and inscriptions, and the mix of ceramics that they find there would suggest again that this was probably just a caravan stop on the way. And it was also destroyed in the 6th century. So, we come to Tel Malhata. And after looking at all these different sites, this, I believe, is the best candidate for an Edomite occupation in the area. Although there is a mixed assemblage of the pottery, the overwhelming percentage of the cooking pots was Edomite. So, the Kos inscriptions were also found there, and the cultic things as well. So we have in Malhata this chappie here playing the double flute, and he's similar to the finds that we got on Kitmit, and also this one in Busira in Edom. And as I said, you've also got the inscriptions, not many, but there's 4 ostraca with the name on it and a couple of jar handles. So it certainly served the general population. There's also a pillar figurine that they found there, and these pillar figurines, I think, are associated with nursing mothers. They're not, often people have thought of them as being some sort of like little idols that you keep, but these could be the worshippers taking them and leaving at the temple, and these have been found also at Talmata. So this evidence, by the presence of these 10 female pillar figurines, would suggest, oh sorry, I've moved on, need to get to Kitmit. Sorry about that, lost my place. So Horvat Kitmit. Now this is just 5.5 kilometers southeast of Tel Malhata. And the overwhelming Edomite pottery assemblage there, particularly the cooking pots, were Edomite. There were Kos inscriptions there as well. There was a lot of those. And the cultic iconography also suggests that Horvat Kitmit was an Edomite shrine. They're very similar to what's happening at Tel Malhata. It almost certainly served the general population at Tel Malhata. This is advanced by the presence of also 10 female figurines that we see there, and there are some examples of the ones that we find in Edom. This would suggest that the shrine was visited by women and nursing mothers, and this being indicative of serving a nearby settled population. The paucity of Judahite and coastal finds would militate against this shrine being used by traders in the area. Some more of the figurines. So, beginning to sum up. Nonetheless, all these sites were investigated and destroyed by the end of Iron Age 2. Furthermore, all the reported Edomite finds were found under destruction layers. It seems on the basis of this evidence that none of these sites were stormed by the Edomites, or else they would expect the Edomite settlements to be above those layers. Whether the Edomites actively attacked and captured Tel Malhata and Aroa is not certain. If they did, they probably operated as an allied contingent in the Neo-Babylonian army, given the defensive structure of that site. However, what seems likely is that the given crumbling infrastructure of the Judahite kingdom during the second campaign against Jerusalem in 587 BC, these fringe settlements would not be reinforced. They would not be thought of looking after. They're protecting Jerusalem. They're protecting the innards of the country. And so they would be stripped to their garrisons and their people. And this would be an opportunity, if the Edomites were moving in, to take those few sites that I've mentioned. So, quickly summing up and looking at Beit Ariah's suggestions, that the fortifications in the Negev, okay, his first suggestion, that these were to protect the trade routes. Well, as we've seen, this line of fortifications was always being breached and it was always falling apart. These fortifications were there for probably just protection of caravans and to protect the local trade coming through. The establishment of an Edomite sanctuary at Horvat Kitmit definitely seems to be Edomite in its iconography and all that, and it seems to be serving the town of Tel Malhatta. There seems to be a strong link there. So I think the Edomites are in control in the area. The abundance of Edomite artifacts were more often or not found in destruction layers in the Judahite settlements and appear to have been destroyed during the Neo-Babylonian campaign, maybe the earlier one of 597. Although we can't be sure when about these happen. We've also seen that there's been a small proportion of Edomite painted ware found in some of these assemblages. And in fact, in Edom proper, the Edomite painted ware is in abundance in these sites. So again, the fact that there is not a lot of Edomite painted ware in these sites tends to suggest that they weren't occupied by Edomites, apart from, say, maybe Tel Malhatta. Then we looked at the evidence of the Bible, and we saw it's sketchy at best as to what's happening and what's going on there, although I think that there is an element and a fear that the Edomites are moving into the area. What I needed to do during my thesis, which was another thesis in itself, is looking to see the relationship between Edom and how the Idumeans move in later on towards the middle of the Persian period. And then finally, Ostracon 24, about the feared Edomite incursion, doesn't seem to add anything, and it's not in a stratified context, so we can't put too much weight on that. So let me just quickly sum up. It seems highly likely that much of the Edomite pottery found in southern Judah was the result of a peaceful penetration of an Edomite population in search of a livelihood that traces the Edomite caravans travelling the trade routes that cross the Negev towards the Mediterranean ports. This would certainly explain why much of the tradable ceramics are found in the early 6th century destruction layers. So the Edomites were already moving in the area as peaceful traders. However, this is not the whole picture. There was a sizable population of Edomites at Tel Malhatta, and this is evidenced by the large percentage of Edomite cooking pots and close proximity of the Edomite shrine at Horvat Kitmit. Tel Malhatta's location in the middle of the Beersheba Arad Valley would have been an obvious choice to control the trade route. Furthermore, although not particularly specific, Edom is condemned by the Hebrew prophets for the violent and aggressive stance towards Judah at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. Even though Edom and Judah appear to have some form of trading treaty in the 7th century, by the early 6th century, that relationship appears to have completely changed. It was my contention that there was an Edomite population in southern Judah in Iron II. I do not believe it was extensive, as some scholars, such as Beit Ariah, claims. Much of the Edomite material appears to have come as a result of trade. The vast majority of the destroyed sites in the northern Negev probably met their fate at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar in 598 or 586 BC, and not by the hands of the Edomites and their aggressive policy. Nonetheless, the Edomites probably received the Beersheba Arad Valley, the trade route, from the Neo-Babylonians as part of the division of the spoils. Edomite control of the northern Negev would free up the Neo-Babylonians from having to garrison the area themselves, and thereby saving money and troops. At the same time, Nebuchadnezzar could reap the revenues from a trade route through a tribute being paid by a loyal and grateful vassal. Thank you.
Next two speakers I'll be introducing them. Benjamin Scolnic. Rabbi Ben is from the Northeast. He is our featured speaker tomorrow night. teaches at Southern Connecticut State University, but is also a full-fledged, full-time family rabbi. I mean, he's got a synagogue. He cares for the families that are there. And he'll be speaking on the book of Daniel and modern theories about the persecution that led to the story of Hanukkah. And so those of us who are not Jewish will especially learn a good bit. And those of you who are Jewish still have something to learn from your rabbi, so pay attention. We'll follow Rabbi Ben with Gary Rendsburg, who will be speaking to us. Gary comes to us from Rutgers. Both of these gentlemen have been with us before. We're honored to have them back. Gary will be speaking on Septuagint, which is a label given to Greek translations of the Old Testament scriptures, synagogue, symbiosis, the Jews of Hellenistic Egypt. Both of these gentlemen will be their own timekeepers in a sense. I'll tell them how much time, but they've both got to get back in time for Sabbath, which starts at sundown, so they're on their own time clock to get back for that. And then our last will be Tom Davis, a good friend of our library and our efforts here, who will be speaking on Jews in Cyprus in Hellenistic times. Each of these gentlemen world-recognized gurus in their area and what they'll be speaking on. So do you have your handouts? Are we ready to go? Then with that, I give you, and I ask you to give me a warm Houston welcome to Rabbi Ben. This will be yours. Okay. He's got it muted. So you can put it on whenever you're ready.
Celebrated Hanukkah, a festival of lights and miracles. A simplistic story was often told, and it went something like this. An evil Greek king by the name of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, thought that he was a god. Jews were killed for practicing their religion. A small band called the Maccabees fought a guerrilla war against the mighty Greek Empire, winning victory after victory until they regained their religious freedom. The Maccabees found the temple in Jerusalem polluted by pagan rites and restored it to the worship of the one God. Over 2,000 years later, Jewish people still celebrate Hanukkah, which means dedication, to remember that great victory and to cherish religious freedom. Comparisons are often made to the American Revolution. Now, this story is based on the apocryphal book of 1st Maccabees. Let's see if this is going to work. Good. And describes the Seleucid King Antiochus IV's role in the persecution of Judaism in Judea in 168 BCE. The king wrote to all his kingdom for all to become one people and for each to abandon his own customs. Many Israelites accepted his religion and sacrificed to idols and violated the Sabbath. The king sent letters containing orders to violate Sabbaths and festivals, to defile temple and holy things, to leave their sons uncircumcised, so as to forget the Torah and violate all the commandments. Whoever disobeyed the word of the king was put to death. Now, even among skeptical scholars, there is no doubt that these events occurred. Here is Shia Cohn. What provoked the persecution by Epiphanes remains an enigma in spite of intense study by many scholars, but a persecution there was. And the war it provoked is history's first recorded struggle for religious liberty. As for historicity, Seth Schwartz says, there can be no doubt about the main claim that Antiochus issued and enforced decrees against the practice of Judaism. So everybody agrees that there was a persecution. There are several modern explanations for the persecution. The most important view of the traditional version is that of the Israeli scholar Victor Cherikover, who reconstructs the series of events leading to the persecution in a different way. In other words, everybody agrees that there was a persecution, but why? And what's bothering everybody is that this was a polytheist. King Antiochus IV was a polytheist who worshiped many gods. Why would he persecute any religion for anything? His father, King Antiochus III, had a decree where it was like an edict of tolerance for everybody. All of his predecessors had done the same thing. Why all of a sudden is there this anomaly? So Cherikover says the following. It was not the revolt which came as a response to the persecution, but the persecution which came as a response to the revolt. Only on this assumption can we understand Antiochus' decrees and their political purpose. The Jewish faith was faced not after Antiochus' decree, but before it, with the alternative of renouncing its existence or fighting for its life. So what Cherikover is doing is rearranging the sequence. He's saying that after Antiochus sent Syrian troops to Jerusalem and formed a military colony in the Acra, those troops used the temple for their worship and opened the temple to polytheistic citizens of the new Greek Jerusalem. A conservative group, the Hasidians, saw all this as a desecration of the temple and rebelled. Now, a weakness of Cherikover's hypothesis, in my view, is that, again, he changes the sequence of events. First, Maccabees says that the persecution was the cause, not the result of the revolt. Cherikover rearranges the sequence to explain this anomaly of why Antiochus IV initiated a religious persecution. It may not be a coincidence that Cherikover was an Israeli scholar, and he sees the Maccabees as the forerunners of the modern Israelis, fighting for freedom from persecution and independence. He may have seen a reflection of his time and his place in the 160s BCE. The prevailing modern view is that of Elias Bickerman, the greatest scholar of the Hellenistic world, and he claims that 1 Maccabees 1 is just historically false. The impetus for the persecution came not from Antiochus IV, he wouldn't have done this, but from the Jewish Hellenists, led by the high priest Menelaus, who wanted to change the very nature of Judaism. These Jewish Hellenists, Bickerman says, wanted to assimilate into the Greek world by getting rid of the Jewish identifying mark of circumcision and the other particularistic Jewish rites and rituals. These Jewish people, Bickerman says, put Antiochus up to the persecution. He didn't really have any interest in changing the religious beliefs and practices of his subjects. Menelaus received military aid from Antiochus IV that developed into the religious persecution. It was a civil war. It wasn't a revolution. It was a civil war between different groups of Judeans. Since it was not Antiochus IV, but Jewish leaders who were the instigators of the religious persecution, this whole problem, this whole anomaly of why Antiochus IV was a religious persecutor is just removed. Now, this alternate version is derived from a selective reading of a different apocryphal book, 2 Maccabees, which is not what it sounds like, a sequel to 1 Maccabees, but a different account of many of the same events. A weakness of Bickerman's position, in my view, is that it must discard the clear statement that we saw of 1 Maccabees 1, passages in 2 Maccabees, which I'm about to tell you, and as I will emphasize, passages in the biblical book of Daniel. Since Bickerman bases himself on 2 Maccabees, it is instructive to see that 2 Maccabees 5 explicitly states that Antiochus was angry over the revolt in Judea and massacred its inhabitants, and that 2 Maccabees 6:1 states that, I'm sorry, I went too far. But sent Gairon the Athenian to compel the Jews, I can't see it in the sun, I don't know what it says, to something to their ancestral laws and to cease living by the something, and also to defile. Anyway, what it's saying is that King Antiochus IV sent somebody to do this persecution. So why does Bickerman say that Antiochus IV didn't do the persecution and there was the Jewish Hellenists? Why does he disregard passages in 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees, and as I'll show you, the book of Daniel? I don't know, but Bickerman was a European Jewish man who saw the assimilation of Jewish people, saw different Jewish groups in modern European countries, and maybe he saw a reflection of his time and place in the 160s BCE. In other words, I'm trying to say something about scholarship. You have to know who the scholar is. The scholar is asking questions in a certain way that reflect the questions of his time. Klaus Bringmann, good, says that we shouldn't think that King Antiochus IV persecuted the Jews because they wouldn't abandon their religion. Instead, his motives were only political and economic, and I'm going to just summarize this. He says that Menelaus was bringing in the money, and so he wanted to defend Menelaus, and so he officially issued the edict, but the onus is no longer on Antiochus IV at all, but on the Jewish priest Menelaus. And a weakness of this hypothesis, in my view, is that in these different passages, the persecution of Judaism always precedes the establishment of the pagan altar in the temple, and that it doesn't say that Menelaus was the one who was the persecutor. Now, the latest scholarly fad is to shift the blame of the persecution from Antiochus IV to his own advisors and generals. The Seleucid Empire was huge, and in a kingdom as geographically huge as the Seleucid realm, we shouldn't think that a king would be concerned for one minute, one way or another, about a religion of the little land of Judea. In the most comprehensive recent study, Mittag states that the origins of the persecution are to be found in the interplay between Seleucid officials and Jewish groups. Antiochus' role was limited. Again, all of these theories fly in the face of the passages involved, and they all take the persecutor label away from Antiochus IV. So the question remains, why would a religious persecution be the response to a political uprising? That's where the discussion is today. All of these theories are valuable. All of them advance the discussion. All of them are brilliant. But they all seek to avoid the problem of a polytheist who persecutes a foreign people for their worship of their own religion in their own land. Antiochus IV's persecution of Judaism in Judea in the 160s BCE remains the most perplexing enigma in Hellenistic and Jewish history. The question remains, I'm going to say it again, why have a religious persecution be the response to a political uprising? So, I'm working on a new theory, and this is audacious of me, after all of these brilliant men have tried, and my attempt is to utilize a source always neglected by all of these interpretations, and that is the biblical book of Daniel, which absolutely condemns Antiochus IV for instigating the persecution and states why and when. Now, why do none of these scholars talk about the book of Daniel? I'm not sure. Maybe it's prejudice against the Bible. Maybe it's not thinking the Bible is a historical source. I don't know. I just know that the references to the book of Daniel in all of their works are few and far between, when actually the book of Daniel gives us a detailed account of the persecution. And I also insist that we should study Antiochus IV's career before the persecution. Knowing his biography, like knowing anybody's biography, reveals a lot about the person. And it reveals in this case that Antiochus did not instigate the first religious persecution in history, which is what everybody is saying, but imitated a violent religious persecution to which he himself was a first-hand witness. Knowing his biography can lead us to an understanding of why he did what he did, and this view will fit perfectly with what the book of Daniel says. The Antiochian persecution must be seen in a context. It's in the context of the rise of Antiochus IV and his need for power and money that caused the rise and fall of the high priest Jason in Judea and the rise of the high priest Menelaus in Judea. And so if we study Daniel, especially chapter 11, verses 20 through 24, and other extra-biblical evidence, we may be able to provide a political and economic context for all of these enigmatic events. Now today, very quickly, I can only present a quick outline of a reconstruction of this context. Since what I'm going to be saying is going to seem very different than the usual theories, I just want to tell you that I have published detailed articles on I think, all of the matters I'm going to be talking about. So, here's Daniel 11:21. Let me give you the background. Here's the historical background that we're going to need. From 192 to 188 BCE, Antiochus IV's father, Antiochus III, waged war against the ascendant Roman Republic. He lost. And under the stipulations of the treaty, Antiochus III was forced to retreat, pay annual tribute of 1,000 talents, and send hostages to Rome. His son, our nemesis, the future Antiochus IV, became the principal hostage in Rome for 12 years, from 187 to 175. Even after his father died and his older brother Seleucus IV became the king, they left him in Rome. Now, why is this so strange? If you would know about the Seleucid kingdom, you would know that princes were always used as big administrators, as viceroys. They had huge positions. They were commanders of armies. And to leave him in Rome is to scorn him. And indeed, Daniel 11:21 says, "There will stand in his place a scorned man who was not given the splendor of royalty, and he will come and take the kingdom, the kingship, with schemes." So that's what Daniel says, and it is absolutely correct. Antiochus IV is cooling his heels for 12 years in Rome, waiting to get back, waiting for a position, doesn't get it. Finally, he has something to do with the assassination of his older brother Seleucus IV, and he comes back with a vengeance, but there's a problem. And the problem is that Seleucus IV, his older brother, had a couple of sons, and one of them's name was Antiochus, just to get you even more confused. And so there's this little boy, and we have his coins, this little boy named Antiochus, who is the rightful heir to the throne, and our guy, Antiochus IV, is just the uncle of the king who has never held a big position in the kingdom, but he wants to be king. And so he comes in with the help of Rome and Pergamon and a couple of other forces, and he comes in, and he is very appreciative of what Rome has done for him. When he was in Rome, he loved Rome. And all of the things that you see on your screen, he would wear a toga. He ran for office, even though he didn't have any office to run for. He sat in a Roman chair. He reviewed the soldiers in triumphal processions. He loved gladiators. He employed Roman architects. And there are more very specific pieces of evidence to show that he loved Rome. And he even said at one point, "You treated me like a prince, not like a hostage." And this is while his own family was leaving him there. So, for all of the theories that I told you about, I didn't tell you about another one by Jonathan Goldstein, may he rest in peace, which has been discarded and rejected by just about everybody. And even Goldstein himself, towards the end of what turned out to be the end of his life, sort of made modifications. But he had this very important point. The years during which the future Antiochus IV was in Rome were epoch-making in the history of the development of Roman civic and religious institutions. Antiochus IV modeled his persecution, Goldstein says, on the persecution of the Bacchants, Bacchus Dionysus in Rome, when he was a hostage there in the 180s BCE. For Goldstein, and I think he's right, the most important event for understanding why Antiochus IV persecuted Judaism was that the Roman Senate conducted a persecution as a response to the growing popularity of the Dionysian cult that it saw as undermining of and as a challenge to the very meaning of political existence within the Republic. Livy informs us that the rapid spread of the Bacchic cult, which he claims indulged in all kinds of crimes and political conspiracies at its secret meetings, led in 186 BCE to a decree by which the Bacchanalia, and remember these are religious rites, and this is a religious group, they were prohibited not only in Rome but throughout all Italy, which was really a foreign country. According to Livy, the measures against the Bacchants, the Bacchic cult, were conducted over a span of 5 years, so this wasn't just one little massacre, took the lives of 7,000 people, the majority through execution. They were being executed for living lives in their religion, caused great terror inside and outside of the city, numerous suicides, and a mass flight of these people from Rome. And according to Cicero, the measures even included military attacks on the group. Now, the Roman Senate's decision to suppress the Bacchanalia in 186 BCE constituted, as far as I know, and I'm hoping that my friends, the other scholars, will help me and give me other parallels, but as far as I know, constituted the largest systematic persecution of a religious group to that point in history, at least as I know it. While Hume and others always insist that there's a strong interrelationship between monotheism and religious persecution, I think that polytheistic societies may have been quite capable of systematic religious exclusion and persecution. In Rome, religion and the state were one. It was a civic religion. And as Livy presents it, this new Dionysian religion could have become a second political power that would undermine family and class and gender distinctions. The Senate may have seen the Bacchanalia as a religious revolution, the formation of a religious organization on the basis of a new principle for religions of individual membership. The situation may have been seen as a collision of two forms of religiosity, the religiosity of the Roman state cult that fostered the political community, and the apolitical religiosity, which was often orgiastic, of the worshippers of Bacchus Dionysus that promoted the fulfillment of the physical individual and his or her desires. Those who know the history of early Christianity in Rome will start to see some parallels. In short, Antiochus learned that religion can be politically problematic. So it's fair to conclude we have every right to think that Antiochus IV took all of this in. He was there at the time and watched over those 5 years a religious persecution. He had come to Rome not as a child, but as an adult who could integrate his experiences in sophisticated ways. He was an extremely ambitious man, a smart and crafty survivor who was skilled in warfare and diplomacy. It is at least plausible that he integrated aspects of his experience in Rome into the view of how the power of a state can be applied when you need it. Now, the Roman historian Appian says that Antiochus finally came back after 12 years as a hostage to Antioch, the capital of the kingdom, after his older brother Seleucus IV was assassinated in 175. And he says, afterward, on the death of Antiochus the Great, that's his father, his older brother, that's Seleucus IV, succeeded him and gave his son, that's a guy named Demetrius, you don't have to remember that, as a hostage to the Romans in place of his brother, that's Antiochus IV. When the latter arrived at Athens on his way home, Seleucus was assassinated as the result of a conspiracy of a certain Heliodorus, one of the court officers. And everybody wants to know, historians want to know, why did Heliodorus, who, by the way, was like a foster brother to Seleucus IV, they'd grown up together. He had the most important position in the kingdom next to the king. Why did he assassinate the king? Well, if they read their Bibles, they would know. Because Daniel 11:20 says, his place, that is Antiochus III, will be taken by one who will dispatch an officer to exact tribute for royal glory, but he will be broken in a few days, not by wrath or by war. In other words, he was assassinated. Daniel 11:20 is prophesying the assassination of Seleucus IV, which is a historical event, as we know from that passage in Appian. So why does Heliodorus do this? And what we can understand is that Seleucus IV was just gathering money. He wasn't doing wars, he wasn't building, he was just gathering money, and there was resistance. And that resistance is seen in 2 Maccabees 3. You've seen the painting of horses, coming and whipping a guy. That's a famous painting about this scene, how Heliodorus came to Jerusalem. And the way I take it is that this supernatural epiphany can be read as Heliodorus' culminating realization that this is no good, that this king is going to create a revolution among all of the countries. And so Heliodorus and his guys assassinated him and put this little boy, Seleucus IV's son, Antiochus, as king. The only thing is it backfired on Heliodorus because these guys are thugs, right? These guys were they were terrible, evil thugs. These kingdoms, these Hellenistic states, were just corporations, and all they cared about was money and bringing in the money, and they would kill anybody and do anything. But the worst guys were the guys at the top, who were always busy killing each other and poisoning and doing all sorts of things like that. So this Heliodorus, as Appian says, when he sought to possess himself of the government, in other words, he was going to become the regent to this little boy king, he was driven out by Eumenes and Attalus. They are the king and crown prince of Pergamon, who installed Antiochus, that's our guy, therein in order to secure his goodwill. So now Antiochus IV is the regent. Now there's a big difference between being a regent and being the king. The boy, the rightful heir, Antiochus, this little boy, is still the king, and Antiochus IV is the regent, but that's not good enough. He doesn't care that he's ruling the kingdom. He wants to be king, and even though this boy is his nephew, he's not satisfied. And so what he does, he goes on this quiet campaign, and Daniel 11 is going to give us a few verses. I'll give those to you in a minute. I'm just giving you the context, that he had to rise to power. This boy had the establishment on his side. They liked him because they could control him. But Antiochus IV wanted to be king, but he needed to bide his time. He had to get stronger and stronger, and he needed lots of money in order to do it. So now I'm going to read you these verses in Daniel, so I can show you the succession, how it lays it all out. Again, I've read this verse before. I'm going to read it again. There will stand in his place a scorned man, that's Antiochus IV, who was not given the splendor of royalty. In other words, they didn't let him do anything. And he will come, as he did, and take the kingship with schemes. He did not become king very quickly. It took years. The forces of the flood, this is Daniel 11:22, including the prince with whom he made a compact, that's this little boy that I keep talking about, who's the king, will be overwhelmed and broken by him. 11:23, and from the time an alliance is made with him, he will practice deceit, and he will rise to power with a small nation. Now, this guy would do anything, this Antiochus IV. So what he does is he marries the mother of the boy, who's like the queen mother. He marries her, and they have a child together. And so he waits for a few years till this child, his natural heir, would be able to be king if he were killed, and then he assassinates his nephew. And 11:24, he will invade the richest of provinces unawares. All of scholarship says Antiochus was the king already when he came. It's not true. Daniel 11 has it right. It took him years to gather the strength, and will do what his father and forefathers never did, lavishing on them spoil, booty, and wealth. He will have designs upon strongholds, but only for a time. So Daniel 11:21 through 24 is right. He became regent in 175. He married the boy king's mother, and he intrigued, and he plotted, and he put his friends in positions of power. And he may not have become co-king. He may have become co-king in 172, but it was not sole king until 170, 169. Now you say, how do you know that? So, okay, so you believe in the Bible. You believe that the Bible is truth. You believe that the Bible is historical. We have good historical evidence to corroborate everything I was just saying. And we have coins. Coins are a wonderful segment of evidence because they are officially minted by the state. And we see pictures of this boy. We have no less than 12 different coins from no less than 4 different cities and at least 19 different moneyers that represent the kingship and legitimate succession of the boy King Antiochus, son of Seleucus IV. He must have been king for several years. We also have Babylonian evidence. The astronomical diary corroborates the idea that Antiochus IV was not sole king until 170 or 169. The Babylonian king list even differentiates between the date of the execution of Antiochus, son of Seleucus IV, in 170, and the sole kingship of Antiochus IV in 169. So it took him years to become the king, something the scholarship does not recognize. But the book of Daniel has it, and it has it in 3 different places. And one of them is a passage that I bet a lot of you know from Daniel 7 about the horns, the beast with the horns. And here's Daniel 8, that Antiochus was impudent and versed in intrigue, who will destroy the mighty and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning, he will use deceit successfully. He will make great plans, will destroy many, taking them unawares. So you've got extra biblical evidence to corroborate what the Bible is saying. Now, what does this have to do with our main subject? Jason was the high priest. But let me go back a minute, because a couple of the other lectures touched on this. There was a guy named Onias III, really great high priest. There are passages about him in different things. An upright, outstanding high priest. Had a younger brother named Jason. Jason wanted to be high priest. Jason goes to Antiochus, who was on the make. He was trying to make money. And Jason says, I'll tell you what I'll do. I can get more taxes and temple vessels and things like that out of Judea. I'll give them to you so you can bribe people so you can rise to power. Antiochus IV, as regent, says, you're in, right? Onias III goes to Antioch in exile, and Jason becomes high priest, but he didn't get him enough money. So in 172, Jason, who's in trouble because he's not getting him enough money, sends an associate named Menelaus up to Antioch to talk to Antiochus and to say, the check's in the mail. The money's coming. Don't worry. But Menelaus doesn't do that because he's a thug too. And he says to Antiochus, make me high priest and I'll get you the money that Jason didn't get you. And so now Menelaus becomes the high priest. So the gradual rise of Antiochus during those years provides the political context for the rise and fall of Jason and the rise of Menelaus in Judea. Antiochus IV, I'm just repeating what I just said, replaces Onias III with his brother Jason as the high priest of Judea because Jason promises the kinds of sons Seleucus IV had sought. Antiochus IV gradually replaces supporters of Heliodorus and the young king Antiochus with those more loyal to him, such as several Milesians. I have a whole article just about that, how Daniel nailed this, that it knows exactly who his associates were, and with those who promised him even more money, such as Jason in 175-74 and Menelaus in 172. Okay, now comes a big scene. Antiochus is now the king. It's 169. He's knocked off his nephew, which is really not very nice, and he invades Egypt. His idea is that Rome is involved with the Macedonian kingdom. When Alexander the Great died, all sorts of things happened, but eventually there were three great kingdoms. The Seleucids based in Syria and Babylonia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Antigonids up in Macedonia. Well, the Romans were fighting the Antigonids. While they were busy fighting them, Antiochus, who's now king, on his own, the boy is dead, goes and invades Egypt and conquers it. And what he does is he sets his nephew, because they're all interrelated, another nephew, in power, but this nephew has the nerve to sort of care about Egypt or something like that. And so he gets together with his sister and brother, and they throw off the idea that they're going to be vassals to their uncle. So he invades again in 168, and now comes this big scene. It's called the Day of Eleusis. This may sound familiar to you. Antiochus is at the gates of Alexandria, the last place in Egypt he has to conquer. He's on the beach, and a few Roman ships come up from Cyprus. My friend Tom and I have an article just about this aspect of things. And this guy, Popilius Linnaeus, gets off the ship. And by the way, this is in all sorts of sources, in Polybius and Livy and all sorts of things, exactly the way I'm going to tell you. He gets off the ship, and he draws a circle with his walking stick around Antiochus IV and says, you have to decide. Either you leave Egypt right now. I know you've conquered it twice, but either you leave right now, or I'm bringing Rome down on you because we won that war against the Macedonians. We're not busy anymore. We're coming after you. And I think, even though I can't prove this, that he's got, if you can follow this, Seleucid IV's other son, Demetrius, as a hostage in Rome. If they send him back, he's the true heir because Antiochus IV was only the brother of the king. So Antiochus IV has this problem, right? He's on the beach. There's a circle around him. He says, look, I'd like to have a board meeting, right? I want to talk to my guys. He says, no, you can't walk out of, I'm not making this up. You think the Bible's imaginative? I mean, really. He says, you cannot talk to your guys. You have to decide. He says, well, in that case, I guess I'll leave. So he leaves. After conquering Egypt, and this is his history, we have all sorts of sources, he leaves. But he's angry, and he's worried because he has this kingdom that goes from Judea to Afghanistan, and power is the perception of power. In a kingdom that's that far-flung, if they hear that he's been humiliated by the Romans, he's done for. None of them want to be part of the Seleucid kingdom. They're not loyal to it. Everybody wants to have their own state and their own control. And so it's a dramatic humiliation, and he's got to do something because this humiliation threatens the perception of his power in his own kingdom. It's at that moment that something happens. Remember Jason. Jason was the younger brother of Onias III, the high priest, who had then been thrown out because he didn't get enough money. Well, Jason has been cooling his heels in the Transjordan, and he's been gathering up a force, just waiting for a moment to come back and to become high priest again against Menelaus. So he hears a rumor. Remember, they didn't have the internet. He hears a rumor that Antiochus IV has been killed by the Romans in Egypt. He believes it because that was the news. That was on CNN, the Canaanite News Network or something like that. And so he marches on Jerusalem with 1,000 guys, and they have a bloody coup in Jerusalem, and Antiochus IV is not dead. As a matter of fact, he's in Egypt coming back to Syria, and guess what? He's going to pass by Judea. Israel's always had the wonderful fortune of being in the middle of everything just when you didn't want to be in the middle of everything. And he has these thoughts. He remembers what the Romans did. What the Romans did was to use religious persecution for political gain. He had integrated that. And now he's got a reason. Now, the Jews are known for one thing throughout the Hellenistic world, that they're strict and loyal adherents to their religion. If I can knock them out of their religion, everybody's going to go, whoa, he's not humiliated. He's the man. We're going to stay part of this kingdom. We're not messing with this guy. And indeed, Daniel 11 says, everything that I just said, at the appointed time he will return and he will come to the south, but the second time will not be like the first time, and the ships of Cyprus will come back with him, but he will be driven out, and he will return raging against the holy covenant. Daniel had it right. He was humiliated, and he was raging, but he couldn't do anything to the Romans. So, this is what bullies do. When you can't take on somebody your own size, you take on somebody smaller. So, in so doing, he uses that model that he'd learned in Rome, of the persecution of the Bacchants that he'd personally witnessed while a hostage in Rome. So I'm really sticking to the time thing. Here's my conclusion. Antiochus IV learned in Rome that a religious persecution can be a weapon in the arsenal of political power. Jason's rebellion in 168, motivated by rumors of Antiochus' death, but really at the moment of his political humiliation was a pretext for a demonstration of such power. For all of the modern theories that I told you, the Bible knew this thousands of years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that lovely introduction, and as always, your wonderful hospitality here at Lanier Theological Library. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Houston and at Lanier. Septuagint, synagogue, and symbiosis, the Jews of Hellenistic Egypt. We just had some mention from Ben about what happens when the empire of Alexander the Great falls apart upon the death of that great ruler in 323 BCE. This is the extent of Alexander's remarkable empire, stretching from his homeland in the northwestern part, Macedonia, into Egypt, as you can see, across the Near East, all the way through modern Iran, and in fact, to the Indus Valley of modern-day Western India. Quite a remarkable achievement. A bust of the young Alexander, not contemporary with him, but from a couple hundred years later, now housed in the Third Temple, known as the British Museum. When Alexander arrived in Egypt, of course, he had to style himself as if he were, and he was, the ruler of Egypt, and therefore, like all other pharaohs, is inscribed in the documentary evidence with a cartouche of his name, this one now in the Louvre. And of course, you all remember how to read your hieroglyphics from previous Jim Hoffmeier lectures here, and here are the equivalent Roman alphabet equivalents of the hieroglyphic signs being read from right to left to get us the name Alexander. Upon the death of Alexander, there are, again, depending on how you count, Ben mentioned three. I've called this one the four successor kingdoms to Alexander the Great. Two of them up in the northwest again, in what is more or less Greece itself. Ancient Greece included not only modern-day Greece, but also Western Turkey, modern-day Western Turkey. But the two empires, which of course are the largest geographically, are that huge Seleucid Empire, which Ben just referred to here in the golden, and what will concern us this afternoon is the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. So upon the death of Alexander, a couple decades pass, and as the dust settles, you now have these two very large empires with the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty. And if we zoom in a little bit, you'll notice what the map has done here. It has shown you the overlap between the blue and the gold right there in the land of Israel. Ben just mentioned Israel's always in the middle of everything. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids were their boundaries of these two large empires met exactly in the land of Israel. And what this map has done is to try to show you that at times it was ruled by the Ptolemies and at times it was ruled by the Seleucids. For the first 100 years, that is to say almost exactly the 3rd century BCE, down to about the year 200, the land of Israel was ruled by the Ptolemies. Eventually, the Seleucids ousted the Ptolemies, and the Ptolemaic kingdom receded to simply Egypt, and as you can see, west of Egypt along the Mediterranean coast to modern-day Libya, ancient Libya as well. Here are the dates of that Ptolemy dynasty, founded by Ptolemy I, who'd been a general under Alexander. If Ben didn't confuse you enough with the names of all of the Seleucid emperors, the number of Seleucid emperors named either Seleucus or Antiochus, we have the same problem here in Egypt, where the Ptolemy name was clearly the name that was the regnant name, pun intended, of these rulers of Egypt, and various queens, 7 of them named Cleopatra, 4 of them named Berenike, and the famous Cleopatra is Cleopatra VII, the last of those who had liaisons both with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony in the very time, 30 BCE, when the Ptolemy dynasty ceased to exist and it was incorporated into the Roman Empire. So that's your historical background of general history, and let's bring the Jews into the picture. The Jews had lived in, obviously, their homeland of Israel, and as Jim Hoffmeier showed earlier today, in Egypt for centuries, under mainly Persian rule for 200 years, and then under the rule of Alexander the Great. And the Jews were relatively happy to live under such circumstances when the Assyrian and Babylonian deportations are still part of not quite living memory, but of historical, cultural, collective memory, as Lawson spoke about earlier this afternoon. You're very happy, if you're not you can't have your independence, you're very happy to live under rulers such as the Persian emperors and Alexander, and in fact the Ptolemy Empire as well, which allowed the Jews to do what they wanted to do as long as they were loyal members of these empires, which is what they were, and they continued to adhere to their religious tradition, something that Ben just mentioned, and this is brought out very much in our ancient sources, especially the Hellenistic sources into which we are segueing. The later Jewish historian Josephus of the 1st century CE gives us the history of Ptolemy's succession to Alexander and what took place at this time. And he does mention that Ptolemy brought back captives from Judea and Jerusalem in particular. This sounds, as we would not be very happy with such a thing. But apparently the Jews were not so unhappy with this, because Josephus goes on to talk about, well, first of all, on Ptolemy's side, how he had heard that they'd been loyal to Alexander and he wanted them in his midst and placed them to serve in his garrisons in Egypt. We'll get back to that later on. But the paragraph that I'm now quoting there, not the stuff under the bullets, which is an actual quotation from Josephus, at the end of that, Josephus actually says that there were not a few other Jews, that is to say, not many Jews, who of their own accord went to Egypt as invited by the goodness of the soil and by the liberality of Ptolemy. Right? So I repeat the idea that Jews remain loyal members of the empires under which they lived, the exception, of course, being the time of Antiochus IV, as we just heard and just as illuminated so well by Ben. So here is a map of the Ptolemaic Empire indicating the cities in which Jews lived, right? So there's Jews living in Egypt now for several centuries, going back to the time of the end of the kingdom of Judah, as Jim discussed earlier today. And they are concentrated in the time of the Ptolemies, as one would expect, in northern Egypt, the area which is closest to the Jewish homeland in Israel. But they, in fact, do stretch all the way down into southern Egypt, what we call Upper Egypt, as far south as Aswan, something that Jim also talked about. So you get to see the widespread Jewish community over the course of centuries developing, and we're now, of course, talking about the late 4th, and in particular, we'll be talking about the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Some of the evidence for this, we have a Jewish tomb, some of the earlier evidence under the Ptolemies, a Jewish tomb at Alexandria, early on in the Ptolemaic period, with the name of the Jewish person who's buried there in Hebrew script and in Hebrew, Akavia ben Elionai. And this gives, just one of the examples that we can give you actually in Hebrew, which is quite interesting. We also have tomb inscriptions, and many, many more so in Greek, right? So as you have the Alexander's conquest of much of this area, including Egypt, you have an ever-increasing use of Greek, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment even more so, especially in the north, and in particular in the city of Alexandria, right, which you saw on the map a moment ago, I hope, at the northwestern tip of the Nile Delta. This was a brand new city that was founded by Alexander, and of course named for him, and it's styled as a Greek polis, okay, a Greek city with all the trappings of a Greek city. So you think of Alexandria as being in Egypt, and yes, you should think of that, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a Greek city, where Greek was spoken, where the city planning, the urban planning, the institutions, everything about it was Greek. It's a Greek city, just happens to be situated in the land of Egypt. So the ever-increasing use of Greek in northern Egypt in particular is something that we need to be thinking about, so that, for example, tomb inscriptions written by Jews shift from the one I just showed you in Hebrew to inscriptions that are in Greek. And here are two examples, and this comes from the very place that Jim showed you several pictures of earlier, Tel El Yehudia, known in the Hellenistic period as Leontopolis. And we can tell that these are Jewish individuals by the names of the person who was buried there, right? How do we identify Jews in the documentary evidence? Well, you have somebody on the left. We would anglicize his name as Jesus, but it would go back to some form like Yeshua or something like that. And of course, the one on the right somebody whose name was Abraham, now in a Greek style. So that just gives you some of the context as we move into the three S's in the title of my talk: Septuagint, Synagogue, and Symbiosis. The Septuagint is the Bible translated into Greek. Early on in the Ptolemaic period, Ptolemy II is creating the great library of Alexandria. Might as well show you the next slide, which is an artist's imagination of what it was like in the 19th century. You can see this great architectural site and the library. I think the Lanier Library evokes some of the what you see here. Okay, I hope Charles and Sharon are paying attention. Okay, but you see the scrolls. Everything is still written on papyrus scrolls, right? There are no bound books on shelves and so on and so forth. And it's in the reign of Ptolemy II, building the great library, where he decided that he wanted to have a copy of every book that was, like the Lanier vision, of every book that was relevant to the peoples that he ruled. And that would include, of course, Jewish scripture. So that's one version of the story. The other version is that the Jews, that is to say that it was from the top down, that the king decided that he wanted a copy of the Jewish scriptures in a language that he could know, which of course was Greek. The other version of the story is that the Jews of Hellenistic Egypt, over the course of centuries now, no longer knew Hebrew well enough to read the scriptures in Hebrew, that they really needed it accessible to them in a translation into a language which they understood, which of course was Greek. As I repeat, okay, you're in Egypt, but the language is Greek, right? The language of these cities, especially Alexandria and the other smaller cities like Leontopolis in the area, is all Greek. It's probably a bit of both, right? It's very possible that Ptolemy II wanted a copy of the Bible in Greek, and it's very possible that the Jews, these are not competing narratives, right? They sort of, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And the Septuagint was accomplished by these Jewish scholars translating the Bible into Greek in the middle of the 3rd century under the reign of Ptolemy II. And in the course of the next century, the other parts of the Jewish canon, the prophets and the writings, were also translated, so that eventually the whole Bible gets translated into Greek. Now, what did it mean for the Jews to do this? Okay, this is not just something that they did. Let's think about this. This was the first time ever that the Bible was translated into a foreign language, right? The Torah, let's just talk about the Torah, because that's the original part of the Septuagint. This is sacred scripture for Jews. It is canonical to Jews. It has been that way for centuries. We can debate when the Torah was elevated to its canonical status, but certainly been centuries by this point. And there is a need to have that scripture available to people who no longer understood it in the original language. What was it like for the Jewish scholars who sat down to do this for the first time at a writing table or something, where somebody held the Hebrew text in a scroll, right, of the kind of Torah scrolls that we still use today, and started reading aloud with Genesis 1, and word by word said it out in Hebrew, and then somebody, his colleague, wrote it out in Greek, translating each one, so that the person reading the Hebrew said the word Bereshit, and then the person writing it down in Greek said en arche, right, in the beginning, right? And they just went through that way. And I'm going to give you words that you would recognize. And when they got to the third word of the Bible, Elohim, God, they wrote down theos, the Greek word for Greek. And when they got to the next major word there, Shemayim, heavens, right, they wrote down uranon, the accusative case, the Greek word for heaven, our planet Uranus. And then when they got to the last word of the first verse, haaretz, the land, they wrote down the Greek word, with the definite article, ten gein, okay, the land. Think about what it took to do this, and what a remarkable step it was for a religious tradition to translate its scripture, its sacred text, into another language. So if you read your Bible in English today, right, I want you to think about a 2,250-year-old tradition that goes back to the Jews who did this for the first time in Hellenistic Egypt. You take it for granted. You're picking up a translation and you're reading it in English, right? That's what we do. Or you read it in French if you're in France, or wherever you may be, in whatever language. But think about the first time that ever happened. And so we can see in ourselves, when we look at the Septuagint material, or the process which produced the Septuagint, what I like to call, quoting Barbara Tuchman, a distant mirror. But it's not the 14th century CE, it's the 3rd century BCE. Quite remarkably, the Septuagint spread to Jewish communities not only in Egypt, where it was created, but actually outside the land of Egypt, back into the land of Israel, where they in fact still spoke Hebrew and read Hebrew fluently, but they still also now had access to the Bible in Greek as well. And so we have Septuagint fragments amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as the one I'm showing you here, and at another place called Nahal Hever, also on the shore of the Dead Sea, south of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. This will become the Bible of Christianity, of course. Right? The New Testament, written in Greek, almost always is quoting the Bible in Greek from the Septuagint, right? And this, it will then, of course, also allow Christianity to spread into Greek-speaking communities in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so we have all sorts of papyrus fragments of the Bible in Greek, most likely through Christians, although possibly this is the book of Deuteronomy, through Jews as well. We simply can't tell, obviously, from looking at something like this. And eventually this culminates in this becoming the Bible of Christianity, and this is the most glorious manuscript of all of them, from the 4th century, written on parchment, an entire codex called the Codex Sinaiticus, because it was housed for most of its life in St. Catherine's Monastery in the southern Sinai. It is now, most of it is now in the British Library. There are portions of the manuscript elsewhere. If you've been to London, you've seen this in the public display area on the main floor of the British Library, but you don't have to travel anywhere anymore. You can just go on your smartphones right now, use the wireless service here, and go to codexsinaiticus.org and turn every page. The synagogue. The forerunner of the synagogue comes from Hellenistic Egypt. There is an institution called the proseuche, which means prayer in Greek, but also place of prayer. We have about a dozen foundation or dedication stones of synagogues that are being built. The earliest one of all of them is the one here on your left from Schedia, not far from Alexandria, just a few miles east of Alexandria. And notice that it is done in the name of the king, this is Ptolemy III now, the name of the king Ptolemy and his queen Berenike. And these are the proseuche that the Jews are building, these prayer places throughout Egypt at this time. Judaism, may I remind you, is a temple-centered religion. The Bible speaks only of public worship in the single temple in Jerusalem, preceded by the tabernacle. And the idea of collective communal prayer is something that is far into the biblical system, but of course develops amongst Jews first in the diaspora here in Egypt as our earliest evidence for it. And we have these inscriptions one after another. I'll go through these relatively quickly. I'm sorry for the sake of time here. We have so many of these from ancient Egypt. Not a single one, however, was found in situ, that is to say, in the synagogue building. Every one of these inscriptions was found in secondary use. So when the building was no longer needed, some other people just took the stones of that building and built some other building, right? So it was found in a nondescript wall or some other building's wall or something like that. But all of these give us evidence for the development of prayer houses, what will become the synagogue in Hellenistic Egypt. When we get to the 1st century BCE, and we're looking at a few more here in Alexandria, notice that we are now getting, look at this particular one here, we now get the shift of the word proseuche to synagogue, okay? Not that we have that word specifically here, but what we have is the name, or actually it's fragmentary, we don't have the name, but we have here the title of this person, Archaeologos, which is to say the head of the synagogue. And the synagogue, Greek word, right, means the people coming together, again, will be both the community of Jews and the actual building in which they come together, okay? So I want you to now think about this in our distant mirror, right? If you gather communally to pray, if you're Jewish in a synagogue, if you're Christian in a church, or if you're Muslim in a mosque, right? You are gathering in an institution doing something whose origins can be found in Hellenistic Egypt, right? You have created, and it was the Jews of old who did this, created a new system of worship outside anything that was biblically mandated in the Jerusalem temple. They were far enough away that they had to create other systems. Jim showed you this morning this afternoon earlier, two other temples in Egypt, the Elephantine Temple and the Onias Temple, one in the south, one in the delta. You could do that. It goes counter to what the Bible says, where you should have only the Jerusalem temple in mind. But these communities, for their own reasons, created their own temples in Egypt. But more widespread was the development of communal prayer. No sacrificial worship whatsoever. That takes place in Jerusalem. Communal prayer and gatherings such as this, probably with the number of people, more or less, that are seated here today as well. And from there, the synagogue actually spreads to Israel. Just like the Septuagint was read in Israel, the institution of the synagogue also moves to Israel as well. This is a remarkable inscription called the Theodotus inscription, dated to the 1st century CE in Greek, in Jerusalem, in the shadow of the temple. The temple was still standing when this was found, when this inscription was written. Unfortunately, again, in secondary use, we do not have the building. We don't know what this synagogue would have looked like, but it's called the Theodotus inscription because of the name of the donor. We get his name here. By the way, notice the good Greek name that this person has, right? And Theodotus, son of Vetanus, right? No Hebrew whatsoever in his name or his father's name, who was also head of the synagogue, archi-synagogue, and as his father had been and as his grandfather had been. Interestingly, he's also a priest. He comes from a priestly family, but somehow he's outside the temple priestly worship system, and he's now got this synagogue going. What is it for in Jerusalem? What is it for? For the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments and the guest house. This is all in this Greek inscription. And the rooms and the water supplies as an inn for wayfarers and so on. Interestingly, doesn't mention prayer in this one, right? Because if you want to worship and you're in Jerusalem, you go to the temple. But the reading of Torah has now become a sacred act as well. And so that is all part of the traditions that we have inherited, both Jews and Christians, down to the present day of doing these kinds of ritual acts outside of a temple and priestly system. My third S, symbiosis. These Jews, back to Hellenistic Egypt, that was just a quick side trip back into Jerusalem there for a moment for the Theodotus inscription. These Jews in Hellenistic Egypt fully participated in Greek culture. That's what Hellenism was all about. It was the spread of Greek culture from its homeland in classical Greece to other parts of the Near East, Egypt, the land of Israel, Mesopotamia, and so on. Wherever Greek rule spread, Greek culture went with it. One of the most remarkable achievements of one of these ancient Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, was by a man whom we call Ezekiel the Tragedian, just to keep him separate from Ezekiel the biblical prophet. And he wrote a play called The Exegogue in the 2nd century BCE. It is a Greek-style drama. We know that Jews attended the theater. First of all, we have theaters built in the land of Israel. But Philo, whom we'll get to in a moment, Philo the philosopher, also tells us that Jews would go to the theater, that he himself went to the theater in Alexandria. So what were they going to see, and what were they going to see performed? Well, they saw Euripides and Sophocles, just like everybody else did, okay? Aeschylus, all the Greek dramatists. And so Ezekiel, a Jew in that environment in the 2nd century BCE, says, I can write a play too. But I'm not going to talk about Oedipus, some old Greek hero. I'm going to write a Greek play, a play in Greek, Greek-style drama, a tragedy, and I'm going to call it a tragedy, it's not a comedy, a serious play, but I'm going to tell my national story. And my national story is, of course, the Exodus from Egypt. And so he has a 5-act play, just like the Greeks do. We have 269 lines of this play extant, not the whole play, unfortunately. It is written in iambic trimeter, exactly like Euripides did. It's replete with all of the devices of Greek drama, right? You have to have a monologue in a Greek theatrical production. So, of course, that is placed into the mouth of Moses. And every Greek drama has to have, at some point, the messenger arriving to report on the battle scene, because they can't stage all these things, right? So the things that can't be staged, they get narrated, as it were, to the audience, right, through a messenger who reports, right? So you can't stage the drowning of the Egyptians, right? That'll be too difficult in that kind of an environment on the Greek stage. So you have a scene back in the palace where a messenger who was the sole survivor of all the Egyptians who otherwise drowned, running back to the palace to describe the great defeat of the Egyptians. So these are the trappings of a Greek drama, but this is not Euripides, this is Ezekiel the tragedian. Philo the poet, not to be confused with Philo the philosopher, whom we'll get to in just a second, he read his Iliad and his Odyssey. He knew Homer very, very well, living in Egypt. Unfortunately, living in Alexandria, only 29 lines of this poem survive, much to our dismay. We have so little of it, but at least we have it. It's written in hexameter, the same kind of meter, the rhythm that Homer uses, but instead of doing an epic poem about the Trojan War or about the travels of Odysseus and after the Trojan War, Philo the poet decides to write an epic poem about his national literature, and of course it focuses on Abraham and Jerusalem, at least the two largest chunks of this poem that still survive down to the present day. And the greatest example, probably, and the most famous of this symbiosis is Philo the philosopher, and there are his dates. Voluminous writings, all of which are extant today. We have 90 or 95% probably of what Philo wrote in his lifetime, almost all of it in the Greek original. And Philo, again, read all Greek philosophy. He read his Aristotle, he read his Plato, he read the Stoics, he read Pythagoras. He knew it all, he read it all, and it all influenced him. In particular, as you can see here, Plato, Pythagoras, and the Stoics. He had less interest in Aristotle. And to him, the Bible, right, he had to take his Jewishness, which held that the Bible was the source of religious revelation, and his Greekness, as it were, for which the greatest intellectual achievement would be the philosophical truth of the peoples that I've just mentioned, and he brought them together and melded them together into a single system, which is the first philosophy of Judaism that we possess. He used an allegorical approach to Scripture. He would go through the Bible and talk about various things. He got all of this from Plato, right? Plato's tripartite division of the soul is something that you see in Philo. Everything has to have an allegorical meaning in Plato. Therefore, it has to have an allegorical meaning. This may look like a lectern, right? But Plato would tell you this is not a lectern. This is just an imperfect replica of the spiritual great lectern above, right? That's what Plato would tell you. Similarly, that's the way Philo approaches. I use the lectern, not the computer, since Philo didn't know about the computer. And that's how he approaches Scripture as well, right? So Joseph's coat, for example, his coat of many colors, right, isn't just a coat, right? It represents, it's an allegory for the diversity of life that we have, right, because of its many colors. These are the kinds of things that Philo was doing. He gets it all out of Plato and other Greek philosophical traditions. He writes books on the questions, he asks questions and answers them, the questions and answers to the books of Genesis and Exodus, where he goes through and explains passages. Where did he get that from? Because the Alexandrian Greek scholars doing the same thing for Homer, he does it for Judaism as well. Jewish occupations, every possible occupation. They were wool merchants, vine dressers. Notice these names, right? These are Jewish names, okay? Samuelis, right? Samuel. They were farmers, they were potters, they were weavers, they were flute players, donkey drivers, everything. We have a wine tax, ostracon, which records the tax being paid by somebody called Aristomenes, which of course is not a Jewish name, but he is called the Jew from Thebes in southern Egypt, and so on and so forth. And we have soldiers, to get back to where we started, serving in the Ptolemaic army. We have this couple of papyri which describe these Jews, and they're called Jews. This is the best of these. It's in Berkeley right now, listing the Jews who served as soldiers in Ptolemy's army, some of them in the reserves, some of them in the infantry, and two of them serving in the first hipparchy, right? That would be the cavalry elite, okay, of the troops. And just because we all love papyrus, the reverse of that papyrus, you can see the materials here very well. In the interest of time, let me just skip this one, more about soldiers in the army, and bring you to this, which is a map of Alexandria as best as we reconstruct it. You can see the lighthouse there at the top, one of the great wonders of the ancient world, which existed into the Middle Ages, by the way. And you'll notice there's a Jewish quarter in the east and a Jewish quarter in the west. Alexandria might have been 25% Jewish. It's hard to estimate. It was a remarkable city during the Ptolemaic period with an extremely large Jewish community. If I may be permitted one moment to give you a coda. What happened to this Jewish community? Where did it go? Jews continued to live in Egypt in large numbers throughout late antiquity, through the early Christian period, the Byzantine period, into the Middle Ages, and the Muslim period. The largest community of the Jews in Egypt shifted from Alexandria to Cairo in the Middle Ages, and there it thrived, where Maimonides served as the rabbi in the 12th century. And Jews remained there in Alexandria for more than 2,000 years. 2,000 years after the Jews that I have just shown you who lived in Alexandria, the Jews left Egypt en masse in 1956 during the anti-Israel fervor that was stirred up by Gamal Abdel Nasser. A great book on this subject is written by André Assiman, Out of Egypt, a memoir published, oh, that's not 19, that should say 1985, sorry, something like that. It's a mistake, 85 or 95, I don't remember. And Assiman talks about the life of the Jews in Alexandria as he remembered it as a child. And the book ends with their leaving Egypt on Passover. The last chapter describes the last Seder meal they ever had at home as he was a child. And the last words of the book are what I have on the screen here. And he talks about how we walked out of our home along the beach for one last time, where people would see us outside the theaters, our neighbors, as it began to drizzle. And they, our neighbors, would never, ever know, nor even guess that this was our last night in Alexandria. Our family tradition is to read this every year at our Passover Seder to remember how the Jews came out of Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Mark and Jim, and also my delightful friend Ben. You cannot always choose who you work with. This is the first time I encountered Ben. It was a real bridge to cross, not because he was a Jewish rabbi and I was a Christian archaeologist, but because he's a Redskins fan and I'm an Eagles fan. But we found a great unity in our hatred for the Cowboys. I want to jump to a particular province of the Ptolemaic Empire, Cyprus. And Cyprus, you have to keep in mind, has a very specific identity issues. The Cypriot spatial values of island identity, its strategic location, natural resources, and the temporal values of language and religion. Braldel lays out for us that identity is clued in through language and religion. And that is the core heart of who we are. The island identity is very significant for Cyprus. It is a place where people come together and meet in one place and have no way off. On an island, you can't leave. When your neighbors change, you're stuck with them. So when the Egyptians come and the Hittites come and the Assyrians come, they're all there. Not until the 20th century, really, would Cypriots begin to disperse themselves. So that's one of those complex identities of Cyprus, is it is a multifaceted, mixed place. It's strategic location. Everybody comes because there's a real reason to come, particularly when the Eastern Mediterranean is not controlled by one power. As we've seen after the death of Alexander, the Mediterranean's a battleground. And you want to hold Cyprus. It prevents the Syrians from coming down to Egypt, the Egyptians from going to Greece, the Greeks, the Macedonians coming directly into Syria. Whatever you want to pick, somebody has to hold Cyprus, and that person will have a long and secure time of it. Then finally, the major strategic resource is copper. Copper is what Cyprus is most known for. The oldest active copper mine in the world is on Cyprus. It's been mining for 4,000 years, Skiriotissa mine. Scholars estimate that more than 200 million tons of copper have come out of Cyprus. It's enough to denude the island 20 times over to feed the smelters. There's a huge mound of Roman slag still being mined today with chemical methods to still pull out copper. This is the copper engine of the ancient world. So this is what happens when you live in a place like that. You really don't get a chance to control who's coming to dinner and who's not leaving after breakfast. So when the time we open up our story here at the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, this is sort of what has happened to Cyprus and will continue to happen to Cyprus to our day. The Kittim. The Cypriots are other to the Hebrews of the Iron Age. They're the Kittim. We read of Kittim mercenaries in Arad, Ostraca. The regular trade relations between Cyprus and Palestine, their contract is filtered through the Phoenicians, who become the great entrepreneurs of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is even hinted at by the pottery. We find Syro-Palestinian pottery in Cyprus, but no clear evidence of direct presence of Hebrews on the island. The Cypriot limestone cult statues of Persian period Favissa in the Phoenician world indicate this connection that's very strong. If Hebrews came, we can't find them. So they're here, but not here. Now, the Bible witnesses to the fact that the Phoenicians are the main trading partners in the relationship, and so that they carry the goods of the United Monarchy kings. The traditional research agenda is another problem. It's oriented to the West. This is the product of nationalism on Cyprus, that the questions they want to ask are, how are we Greek, not how are we Cypriot? Frankly, if this is my little modern political moment, if the Cypriots ask the question, why am I Cypriot, instead of whether I'm Greek or Turk, the problem would disappear probably in about half an hour. But this affects the research agenda, so the primary drive in archaeology has been to identify connections to the West, to the Greekness of Cyprus, not to the East, not to the Levant. There is direct contact. At one point, between 400 and 380, the king of Salamis on Cyprus controlled the northern Palestinian coast for about 20 years. This was involved in internal Persian civil wars. You remember the great Anabasis of Xenophon, which you probably had to read. After that was settled out, there's an alliance between the Athenians and Evagaris, who were able to control that coastal portion. As far as we know, this is only into the pagan world, though, not the Hebrew world. The world changes. And one of those people, traditionally, when you're raised in history, you learn about the great men, the great figures of impact. Now they don't want to do that at all. Then we'll talk about economic trends and social trends. This is one of the guys you can conjure with. Alexander made a difference. And this is one of the places he did, this entire world. He brings Cyprus into his control to remove the Persian fleet. As I said, you want to control Cyprus to control the coastal world. After his death, according to Arrian, Ptolemy Lagus, who becomes Ptolemy I Soter, intercepts the funeral procession of Alexander, which, by the way, was probably going back to the newly discovered tomb at Amphipolis, which was found this past summer. Huge royal tomb. We don't know really who it's for yet. Probably designed for Alexander. Ptolemy intercepts it. It took him a year to build the beautiful gold coffin, and takes it to Alexandria. Augustus will stop and see the body and knock off his nose, but that happens. Ptolemy bows out of what I want to call the funeral games. He decides he'd rather hold Egypt separately and in his own kingdom than be involved in this great hunt for Macedonian ultimate control. And he will survive safely in Egypt when all the other contenders will be killing each other off to grab Macedonia. After about a generation, it settles out into the four kingdoms that we've already heard about. The beginnings of settlement of the Jews on Cyprus are with Ptolemy. After his conquest of Cyprus in 294 BC, Philo records there are many Jewish communities on the island at this point. Neopaphos, which is the walls of which you see here, was founded as the new center of Egyptian rule, because from here you can sail directly to Alexandria. Paphos is on the far west coast of Cyprus. Salamis is on the far east. Salamis goes to Antioch in Syria, the Seleucid world, whereas Paphos faces directly to Alexandria. And you can sail there, and they would. It's an economic engine. The Ptolemaic system is a closed system. They don't allow economic interchange beyond except very controlled spaces. It's in a way like Syria is, or was until the Civil War. You have to change your coins to Ptolemaic coins. You must use Ptolemaic coins in any interactions within the Ptolemaic Empire. So this limits the ability and freedom economically, but it provides a great engine within the empire. The chief minister is the financial minister of the kingdom. That tells you how important making money is for the Ptolemies. This will follow the pharaonic pattern where all the land belongs to the king. Control over Cyprus is all about protecting the heartland. There were constant wars with Syria over Palestine. Why is Palestine important? Because it's a buffer to Egypt. Always has been. They control over Cyrenaica, the coast of North Africa, western Egypt, and eastern Libya. Again, this is the entry into the delta, the core of Egypt. They have naval bases in the Aegean and on the Anatolian coast. Alliances with Rhodes, a great naval power of the Aegean, to protect the core. Ptolemy II, whom we've all heard about, starting the Septuagint, his ships proclaim him sovereign of the seas. And then Polybius records, because they ruled the territories of Koile, Syria, and Cyprus, the earlier Ptolemies had always been able to put pressure on the kings of Syria, both by sea and by land. The kings of Egypt had never felt anxiety concerning their rule at home, as long as they kept Cyprus. Secondly, for them, Cypriot strategic resources. Strabo records you could outfit an entire ship, everything you need, the wood, the copper for the ram, the ropes, the linen, and the soldiers from Cyprus. This becomes the main source of the naval power of the Ptolemies, because you don't have trees in Egypt you can build ships out of. They need the Cypriot forests. There are strong ties which get established here. Rule is by a strategos, a general, sometimes even an exiled member of the ruling house. And strong cultural ties as well. The funerary patterns of the so-called tombs of the kings right here are actually reflecting the Alexandrian style of tombs. Alexandrian ceramics are in Paphos. The coinage, again, coinage is a very good indicator of connections because everyone has them. Everyone uses them. Neo-Paphos, there's a hoard from the house of Orpheus of 76 coins, of which 59 are Ptolemaic. They're all from Cyprus, except 4 from Alexandria. Again, showing that tight, kind of closed system. Now, what about Jewish ties? Well, this was found in a secondary context in the 5th century house of Eustolius at Corion. This may refer to Onias II, Jewish high priest, third, who founds Leontopolis Temple. Power of religious and physical matters, he challenges Ptolemy III, and this may indeed relate to him. It may not. We don't know. Now, Joseph, the son of Tobias, who becomes the tax farmer for Syria, Phoenicia, Judea, and Samaria, the Tobiads were a family, very powerful ones in Palestine, but not Cyprus. Cyprus is too important in a way to farm out. It's got to be a direct connection. The Amathus inscription is also the other possible Jewish inscription of the Hellenistic period. It's a late Hellenistic fragmentary inscription where Ananias is the presumed ruler of the synagogue, and this deals with ordering cedar wood for a doorway. That's about all I can tell you about it. It was found in secondary contexts, of course, as we just heard, is often the case. They were doing probably refurbishing, but that's all we know. Now, Rome understands geography, and they needed to control Cyprus, and they did. The tail end of the story now I'll jump forward to so you can see the importance of part of the links that continued from the Hellenistic period into the Roman period on Cyprus. This is a major blow to Ptolemaic Egypt. To reduce Egypt and eliminate it as a threat, the Romans took away Cyprus and Palestine. This came under Antony's control after the death of Caesar. And as we know, Cleo gets what Cleo wants. So Cyprus is given by Antony to Cleopatra in 36 BCE. She understands geopolitics. She knows to project To protect the Ptolemaic kingdom, she must hold Cyprus. She even wants Judea as a wedding present. Herod the Great manages to maneuver, and he doesn't have to give it up, but it's close. She makes an emphatic statement of control on Cyprus. The Ouranissos sanctuary on this little island off the coast of Paphos, she builds a temple to Isis and Horus, but actually to Cleopatra and her son Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar. This is where the ships first come. It's the first thing you'll see if you sail from Rome. So when you sail from the Western Mediterranean, the first light you'll see will be the temple of Cleopatra. Now that's called, "This is my world and you've just entered it." Remember that. That's a way of communicating to the Roman space. Augustus will ensure that this never continues after 30 BC in the Battle of Actium. He will make sure, though, he will make the linkage, and his first issue of Cypriot coins look like the issue of Julius Caesar. Caesar's the good Roman, if you're a Ptolemy. They also will make Cyprus an economic asset. This is part of the Roman slag heap at the copper mines. He makes Cyprus a senatorial province. Now, it loses its military significance because the Romans control the whole Mediterranean by this point. But it maintains a very major economic importance because it straddles the sea lanes and is the copper source. Herod is even rewarded by Augustus in being given some of the copper mines on Cyprus. After Actium, though, quite frankly, Cyprus becomes a backwater. It's proconsul rule. Luke gets that right. We only know 1/6 of the governors. This is not where the young up-and-comers go. This is where the old and forgotten end up. Only 6 of them go on to become consuls. And it's under the eye of Antioch. It's not the place where the young mover and shaker wants to end up. It's not rich. It's not militarily significant. So what is the Jewish presence in Cyprus under Rome? Historical accounts, basically. Josephus, First Maccabees, Acts of the Apostles, and Dio Cassius, the great Roman historian. I also want to look at coinage and possible trade evidence. For Acts, we know in Acts 4, Barnabas is a Jewish Christian from Salamis in Cyprus who sells some land he owns in Jerusalem for the church. Acts 11, Cypriot and Cyrene, notice the emphasis of the old Ptolemaic Empire, by the way. Cypriot and Cyrene believers found the church in Antioch. And in Acts 13, Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark make a mission visit to Cyprus, visiting synagogues, plural, throughout the entire island. Now, coinage show a strong Jewish economic presence in the first century on Cyprus. In the first century CE, 40% of all coins recovered from Cyprus are from and minted in Judea. It's a huge amount, percentage. The rest are local Cypriot and provincial issues, mostly Antioch, some imperial. There's an alleged, I use that term alleged because nobody really knows, it's reported to have come from Cyprus, bought on the antiquities market, had 57 coins in it, all of from a jar, all of which were Judean with 3 Nabateans thrown in. That's a huge amount. Now I'm going to look at the pottery evidence, a type of pottery called Cypriot sigillata. Now this is a type of very high-end, elegant dinnerware produced in western Cyprus, around Paphos. And we see it's from the 1st century BCE to the 2nd century CE, and it's exported. The best scholar on this, John Lund, says that part of the production was made especially for export. But we have no information, he says, about the ethnicity of the merchants. Well, I want to challenge that a bit. Lund suggests, by the way, that the pattern of trade may be a product of the Ptolemaic Commonwealth, but he recognizes that there's nothing really in Egypt, which makes that whole idea a problem. But look at the distribution. The bulk of the distribution material goes right to Syria, Palestine, particularly southern Palestine, Judea and Nabatea. That's where the main trade link is for exporting this fine pottery ware. You see the rest of the place where you find it is essentially western Cyprus. It's even more graphic when you compare the drop-off in the trade in the 2nd century. There's a severe drop-off of trade after the first quarter of the 2nd century, after about, say, 125 to 130. Pronounced decrease after 100 CE, and a dramatic one after 150. He suggests a 2nd century earthquake, which we don't really have any other evidence for. Let me give you a possible scenario as to what happened to the trade in this pottery. I think the first drop-off we see in shift is caused by the Jewish revolt in 66 AD, which eliminates, when the Romans destroy Judea, eliminates the market that they're tapping into. It's increased by the absorption of Petra and the dominance of the Nabatean market by Roman Eastern Sigillata after they take over Nabatea and Petra in 106 AD. But the key event is something Dio records: a major revolt against Rome by the Jewish diaspora in 117 AD. He gives no real cause. He locates it in Cyrene, Egypt, and Cyprus. He records that 240,000 people die in Cyprus. No Jew may set foot on this island afterward, he records. There are temples targeted, we know, in Cyrene archaeologically, damage at Isis, Zeus, and Demeter temples. Possibly at the temple of Corion on Cyprus, Apollo is damaged. But what about the trade? I suggest that the merchants carrying Cypriot sigillata off the island and the potters themselves were actually Jewish Cypriots. This explains why Judea, Galilee, and Nabatea are the main overseas markets. And the pagans will try to continue this, but are either unable to create the ceramics or market the replacements. You say, what about an earthquake, though? But an earthquake might damage a kiln, but it's not going to kill all the potters. But a major revolt that concludes in 117 and kills everyone you can grab who's Jewish, if they're Jewish potters, is going to stop the trade. And you see the fall off. Say, wait a minute, it didn't stop till 150. Pottery lasts about 25 years. That's the fall off of what was already made. Then it disappears. I simply ask the question. I have this fact. This wonderful exported type of pottery stops. I have another fact, the destruction of the Jewish community. Perhaps they go together. We'll skip over this part. Let me just go back. After the revolt, Salamis honors Hadrian as the savior of the world for restoring Salamis after the damage of the revolt. And another inscription, Antonine in date, meaning say about 150, forbids an unknown ethnos to have an association. And that's the limit of the inscriptional evidence we really have of the Jews on Cyprus. Thank you.
Perfect.